He will be a staff for the righteous with which for them to stand and not to fall. And he will be the light of the nations and the hope of those whose hearts are troubled. All who dwell on the earth will fall down and worship him, and they will praise and bless and celebrate with song the Lord of spirits. 1 Enoch chapter 48, verses 4 through 5. The modern world doesn't acknowledge, but is nevertheless haunted by spirits, angels, demons, and saints. In our time, many yearn to break free of the prison of a flat, secular materialism, to see and to know reality as it truly is. What is this spiritual reality like? How do we engage with it well? How do we permeate everyday life with spiritual presence? Orthodox Christian priests, Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung, host this live call-in show focused on enchantment in creation, the union of the seen and unseen as made by God and experienced by mankind throughout history. Welcome to the Lord of Spirits.
Hey, greetings, dragon slayers, giant killers, and detonators of demon serpents. Christ is risen. You're listening to the 139th episode of the Lord of Spirits podcast. I'm Father Andrew Stephen Damick, coming to you from the bustling North Carolinian metropolis of Raleigh for the first time from the brand new Three Martyrs studio, the veritable Versailles of vocal vigor, the palace of podcasting.
So, when you say the Versailles of vocal vigor,
No, there's literally a ballroom upstairs called the Marie Antoinette Ballroom. Like, I'm not even joking.
Did you come to some sort of agreement to use the space?
Something like that, yes.
So you realize the Treaty of Versailles was bungled and resulted in millions of deaths in the Second World War?
It's true. It's true.
I don't know why you'd want to invoke that kind of dark history here at the beginning of the show.
My last location was perched precariously over top of a disused gateway to the underworld. So maybe here I'm supposed to stand athwart the guillotine.
I'm not talking. Okay. French Revolution.
It's all one, Father.
Century.
It's all one.
World War II, mid-20th century.
I'm just telling you.
We have deeper issues here than just, you making an untoward reference, comparing.
Sing, swing, savor the sting, Madame Guillotine.
Comparing your new studio and the agreement to found it to one of the most regrettable bunglings in 20th century world history. But anyway.
Well, yes. You, Father Stephen DeYoung, are knee-deep in the swampy muck of Lafayette, Louisiana. So is that better? Probably. At least less deadly.
You could try and connect it to the War of 1812 and the Battle of New Orleans, I guess, somehow. But, it's going to be a strain.
Yep. Well, we are actually live,
was
everybody.
A much bigger debacle.
We are. Other things happen at Versailles, Father. Not all of it is treaties.
Not good ones, really.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Anyway, we are live. We're live. And that means that Mike Hadouken DeGan will be taking your calls starting in the second half. So have you ever wondered what happened to the apostles after the Acts of the Apostles? It turns out that there are various texts from the early church which tell stories about the apostles and what they did next. And some of them are pretty wild. And we all know that wild stories are what you come here for. So that's what you're going to get tonight. But first, we're going to go all the way back to, not Genesis, right? Where we started.
Could.
Why not?
We could go Genesis or Stone Age or something if you really want to. I can figure out a way to do that. And yeah, the wildness of the stories will probably end up being good news for those of you who are upset about the number of ads that this show has on YouTube. Oh, because I'm pretty sure we're getting demonetized with this one.
There we go.
On about 8 different counts.
You're going to give poor Simon heartburn.
Yes. People are going to be clipping this and sending it to our bishops.
Yeah.
That's what I predict.
That's right. I hope so. So where are we starting if it's not Genesis?
Well, we will start with the canonical Acts of the Apostles.
Yeah.
Because what we're going to be talking about most of tonight are non-canonical acts of various and sundry apostles. So there's, of course, just the one book, the Acts of the Apostles, in the New Testament, that picks up, well, really begins with a retelling of Christ's ascension and then moves on in history from there. Does not move that far in terms of consecutive time, right? And then that is the end of narrative, really, for the New Testament. I mean, technically, there are little bits of narrative surrounding St. John's vision in Revelation, but that's stretching it to call
and there's some
Revelation
clues
narrative. From
St. Paul's epistles, but it's not a lot.
He refers to things that happen. Yeah. But in terms of actual just narrative storytelling, that's sort of the last book. But included among the various non-canonical texts related to the New Testament is a whole genre of Acts of the Apostles that are compiled from traditions about different apostles after that take place mostly after the book of Acts, as you mentioned. In at least one case, there may be a little bit of overlap time-wise. But we're going to be talking about 4 of those books this evening. There are some others, and there are some books that sort of blur the line genre-wise, right? Mm-hmm. For example, there are a lot of Gnostic texts that purport to be written by various apostles that will have like some narrative elements about that apostle, as well as stuff about Jesus or kooky visions or other Gnostic nonsense in them. So there's that kind of thing. There's a whole genre of literature ascribed to St. James, the brother of the Lord, in particular.
And that's not what this episode is about. People do get excited about that stuff, but
but that's another set of stuff. Some of that is Gnostic and some of it isn't. So there is other stuff there. So the 4 texts we're going to talk about tonight do not exhaust everything that could be shoehorned into this category. But the 4 texts we're going to mainly focus on are 4 texts that have historical importance as indicated by the number of copies we still have, for example, and the number of translations into different languages we have. That they played some part in one of them in particular played a part in one of the ecumenical councils. All of these 4 are found on St. Nicephorus, the Confessor of Constantinople, his list of texts in the texts that are not read publicly in the church, but are good to be read privately.
Yeah, which is apocrypha. That's what apocrypha are.
Yes, it means private. Does it mean secret or hidden? It means private.
Esoteric secret wisdom.
Yes. And so that's all the way at the beginning of the 9th century. The church still considered these texts to be worthwhile reading and to contain important traditions. A lot of these texts contain the earliest written version of some of these traditions that still exists. We'll get into that, why we're phrasing it that way in a little bit. But with traditions that are also attested to elsewhere outside of these texts. But so that's why we're talking about that's why these 4 texts in particular, I think, are especially worth talking about compared to some of the others. But so to sort of frame this whole discussion, we kind of want to start with the canonical book of the Acts of the Apostles. And the Acts of the Apostles is kind of a weird book in terms of the New Testament canon.
Yeah.
If you stop to think about it. So let's all pause for a moment of thought. No.
A moment of silence, please.
Let's all think about it. So, for example, right, it's in our epistle book, or the book of the apostle, the Apostolicon, or Apostolicon.
Apostolos.
It is in there, whatever fake accent you want to affect. But it's of a fundamentally different genre than everything else in that book. Everything else in that book is an epistle. That's why we so often refer to it as the epistle book, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the vast majority of what's in there. But the book of Acts is also in there. And if you've been attending liturgy since Pascha, you have heard readings from the Acts of the Apostles.
Yeah. Yep.
During the epistle time. But genre-wise, right, in terms of the genre of text, it's basically the same genre as the Gospels.
Yeah, it's narrative. What happened next? And
more to the point, it's volume 2 of a 2-volume work with the Gospel of St. Luke.
Now, did Luke and Acts ever circulate together, like as a single text that we know of?
They did. In fact, the variations that we have are variations across Luke and Acts. So there's what's called Western Luke Acts. That's a whole set of text variants, but they're spread across both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. So, yeah, they didn't circulate independently as far as we can tell.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, right, we have liturgically severed acts from Luke functionally, right? And that's because even though genre-wise it's the same genre as St. Luke's Gospel, obviously St. Luke's Gospel has a different, at least on the surface, main character.
Yeah.
Right? So the main character very directly and on the surface of St. Luke's Gospel is Christ, right? Now, you could ultimately say the same thing about the book of Acts. We'll get to that in a minute. But that's less on the surface, right? The person who's being talked about just on a surface reading of the book of Acts, if you read it out loud, for most of the book of Acts is St. Paul, but not all of it. It's like the last 2/3 or so. And the first third, there's a whole bunch of different people, St. Peter, St. Philip, St. Stephen, right, that are sort of in the foreground, right, with Christ in the background all the way through. This is also, it's kind of a challenging book to the way many of us may have been taught to read the scriptures. So, for example, one very common view of the Old Testament that you will hear is that, well, the Old Testament is just all of these shadows and types that are pointing us to Jesus, right? And implied within that is that sort of, oh, well, now that we have Jesus and we have the Gospels, and Christ has revealed all these things clearly, now, right, the Old Testament and the types and the shadows are kind of obsolete because now we have the fullness and everything. And so
soft Marcionism.
Yeah. And so then when you read the Old Testament narratives, right, they're narratives about people other than Jesus of Nazareth, right? Again, at least on the surface, you could say it's all ultimately about him, but on the surface, right, we're reading about King David or we're reading about King Saul or Ezra or whomever, right? But they are seen as being a type of, they point us to Christ. So they'll talk about, David and Goliath in terms of, right, David as, the future king, we representative Christ, Goliath representing, the devil or the enemies of God, and right. And this kind of typological reading. I'm not saying there's something wrong with that kind of typological reading, right? But the idea that that's all that's going on there, right? That's all that's going on there. And so that the details and the information and even the people themselves, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses, and whomever from the Old Testament, are now sort of obsolete because we just, we just need Christ, right? We have Christ. Christ is God himself. We don't need these images and stuff. Kind of then invokes the question, so why the book of Acts? Why am I reading about St. Peter and St. Philip and St. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, if you got everything in the Gospels that you need from Jesus,
Right. And I mean, the epistles are clearly talking about, right, St. Paul is writing about Jesus, right? So, yeah. But Acts, right? And so just the mere fact of the existence of Acts of the Apostles in the canon says a lot about the idea of the communion of saints, the importance of saints in their own right, not just in how we can allegorically or otherwise get from them to Christ.
Yeah.
That God is glorified in his saints.
I mean, it does say that in the
Read
Bible.
that somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so when you see Abraham, you see Moses, when you see these St. Paul, St. Peter, you see the transformation of their life in Christ, the great deeds they did in the name of Christ, how they preached the gospel for Christ, right? That's not instead of reading about Christ or instead of thinking about Christ, right? That's something that leads you to give glory to Christ, right? This is subtle Plato brain, right? Why are you reading about St. Paul when you could be reading about Jesus?
Yeah.
You could be reading the red letters. Why are you reading the black letters? Right? Which there's a basic illogic to once you move past Plato brain. So we're talking about Acts in particular. So that's in general, right? That's something that Acts, the existence of Acts in the canon, helps us see regarding how to read narrative passages of the Bible outside of the Gospels, right? But in terms of the book of Acts in particular, you kind of find out the most important theme right at the beginning if you read closely. Because St. Luke says that in his first book, O Theophilus, he wrote about all that Christ began to do and to teach. And right there you have the setup for what he's trying to communicate with Acts. That the church, particularly through her ordained leaders, right? But the church is, and what the church is doing on earth is the continuation of the life of Christ. It's the continuation of Christ's deeds, and it's a continuation of Christ's teaching in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's just simply the narrative form of referring to the church as the body of Christ, which is not this metaphor. Right. The church is Christ working in the world.
Right. And that's why right from the beginning, right, what do you immediately see? You see the 11 apostles who are left of the 12 doing miracles. And what miracles are they doing? They're doing the same miracles Christ did in St. Luke's gospel.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus even said that they would do greater things.
But they're always saying, Christ has healed you.
Yes, exactly.
Right? So it continues through the church. Right? The church is the means through which God is acting in the world. Right? And so this then, the book of Acts also, in addition to the sort of retroactive thing we talked about before in terms of helping us see how we ought to read the Old Testament narratives, this also gives us a forward, looking for how we ought to read and understand things like church history and hagiography.
Yeah.
Right. How do we interpret the events of the Council of Nicaea? Because I don't know if you've been on the internet, but there's a lot of ways that gets interpreted. Some of which have little relation to the historical facts, right? Some of which are closer, right? But the Bible doesn't just teach us, our Protestant friends are good about saying, well, the Bible shows us how to interpret the Bible. And I was just making that kind of argument, right? I was saying the book of Acts shows us something about how we ought to interpret the Old Testament. They wouldn't be so happy with the conclusion I came to, but they, they'd have to, I think, endorse the methodology at least. But it also teaches us how to understand the world and history and current events, future event, right? How we interpret what's going on. And the church has, frankly, always done this. This is why we start getting people writing down church history.
Yeah.
Right? They're not just writing it down because, hey, here are some fun facts about this guy you may remember from the canonical book of Acts. Bet you didn't know Thomas went to India. It's true. Right? That's not right. That's not what people are interested in. The reason they're interested in writing it down is what the saints are doing in every generation, what the church is doing in every generation. This is the record of God working in the world in each generation. Because we believe as Christians that there has never been a generation in which God was not at work in the world. And so good church history, real church history, the church's own history, the church's self-understanding of history, right, is always from that perspective, is always from the perspective of recognizing and preserving for posterity what God is doing in the world at any given time, in any given place. Which is a very different understanding of history than the one we get from 19th century Germany. I hope no one ever takes a time machine back to 19th century Germany and loses it, because I'm going to have a lot of angry people showing up on my doorstep.
It's been a while since you've mentioned 19th century Germans on this podcast. I guess we were due for it.
They're going to be very well dressed. They're all going to have canes to beat me with. But they're not going to be dressed for the Louisiana weather. That will be my advantage.
There you go.
So the Acts of the Apostles, obviously, and this really is obvious, right? Or should be, doesn't record everything that happened with every apostle, even during the time period it covers. Right. So aside to like references to the 11 that are especially concentrated at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles, there's a whole bunch of apostles who we never even see specifically singled out. Right? Like Saint Simon the Zealot.
Yeah.
Right? Saint Bartholomew. Right. He's doing stuff, right? He's preaching. We're kind of told generally that the 11 are doing these things, but we don't get specific details, right? Same thing with the women disciples, right? So the Theotokos appears at the beginning of the book of Acts. And if that's news to you, especially to some of our Protestant listeners. Why is that news to you? You're sola scriptura. You're supposed to know these things.
Read the Bible.
Get with the program. Theotokos appears a few times at the beginning with other women disciples, but I mean, we don't get details of like St. Joanna, St. Mary Magdalene, right? Exactly where they went and what they were doing in the book of Acts itself, right? So the book of Acts kind of has its own through line, just like St. John points out in his gospel. There's not enough books in the world to write down every single thing Jesus said and did, right? There's not enough books in the world to write down every single thing that every one of the apostles said and did, right? So Acts of the Apostles is not claiming to do that. Acts of the Apostles is being very deliberately selective. And so the primary through line with the book, the Acts of the Apostles, is geographic. Christ says to the disciples at his ascension that they're going to be his witnesses in Judea and then Samaria and then to the ends of the earth. Right? And so the movement of the Acts of the Apostles as a book is about the gospel going from Jerusalem to Rome, the capital of the empire. And so it follows first the 11 and the other disciples and apostles in Jerusalem, then St. Philip going to Samaria, right? And then St. Paul going out to the ends of the earth, right? Ultimately to Rome. Okay? And so all of these other things are going on. They're going on with the other apostles and other things, but we're not getting all the details in this particular book. Okay? And so all of that reality out there of what the other apostles were doing, right? It's not that that was just instantly forgotten by everyone. Oh, well, it didn't end up in the canonical New Testament, so I guess no one knows. Everyone just forgot. Right? That, of course, is ridiculous. But sometimes you will catch people, especially some of our Protestant friends, talking that way. Right? Someone in my own family said, well, the Bible doesn't say where St. Paul was buried, so how do you know? And my response was, the Bible doesn't say where our grandparents were buried, but we both know.
Right, right.
It's not where either of us lives now either, but we know where it is. Right? And, we can tell the next generation of the young relatives, and they can tell the next generation. It doesn't have to be the Bible, right? It's this idea that, like, facts that aren't recorded in the Bible somehow instantly become unknown. It's kind of weird. Right? And no one would say it about secular history.
Yeah.
Like, who was the Roman emperor after Tiberius? I don't know. It's not in the New Testament.
Yeah. Any claims to the contrary must be false.
Yes. Or at least they're fallible.
Right. Right.
How can you possibly know for sure it's not in the New Testament? I mean, no one would say that. That'd be ridiculous.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, so why is that different for a quote unquote biblical character, which is itself a term that's a little fraught, right? Like, no, this is an actual existing historical human being whom the Bible mentions, right? That doesn't move them into some weird category of being, right? Where, like the few things we know about Herod from the Bible, those are true, but all the stuff about Herod in the Roman records, all the inscriptions he left, all the building got to take that with a grain of salt. That's all. Right? That really doesn't make any logical sense if you think about it very hard for more than a couple of seconds. Okay. But the reason we're bringing that up here is not to sort of bash on certain popular discourse from some of our Protestant friends. It's because we're now about to talk about a bunch of texts that are not in the New Testament, that contain information and traditions about different apostles who do appear in the New Testament. But the particular details are not in the New Testament, but we hold them to be nonetheless true. And so, again, if you want to say to me, hey, a fact appears in the Bible, that means 100% it's true, I'm good with that, right? I'm good with that. But if you're going to say to me, a fact doesn't appear in the Bible, therefore it is false, now I'm going to be like, what?
Right. Right.
Right. Like, so yes, we don't have a detailed account of St. Paul's martyrdom in the New Testament, right? But we don't have any account of his death in the New Testament. Does that mean he didn't die? See what I'm saying? Right? Like, we know he died. Every piece of information we have from the ancient world says he was martyred, and martyred in a certain way at a certain time in a certain place. Why would we not believe any of it?
Yeah.
Right? Like, it doesn't make sense, right? But we'll get into specific things, right, as we go through some of these. So the first one we want to talk about is probably the most important one of the four we're going to talk about, in that it is the one that has been most broadly considered to be historically reliable. Very few scholars, even like secular scholars, like wildly secular scholars, now basically consider the Acts of Paul that we're about to be talking about to be broad, or elements of it, I should say, to be broadly historically reliable.
Yeah, they probably wouldn't go in for the miraculous stuff.
Right. Broadly.
Yeah.
And when I say that, like, there is a weird irony to it, because I can think of at least one major New Testament scholar who thinks that some of the stuff in the first part of the Acts of Paul is more historically reliable than he thinks major portions of the New Testament are.
Huh.
So there you go. That's weird. But yeah. Now there's an agenda behind that'll become apparent here as we go on. But so the Acts of Paul, sometimes the whole book gets called the Acts of Paul and Thecla. But properly speaking, there are sort of subsections of the book, the Acts of Paul, and the first section is, properly speaking, the Acts of Paul and Thecla.
Yeah, because she doesn't show up in the rest, right?
Yeah. And so if you want to be technically correct, which is the best kind of correct, then you say the book is called the Acts of Paul, and the first part is called the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Okay. So as late as Eusebius, so Eusebius is in the 4th century AD. Eusebius says that at his time, there were some churches still existing, like local churches, that considered the Acts of Paul to be canonical.
Oh, so they were reading it out loud in church.
They would read from it publicly.
Yeah, and a reading from the Acts of the Holy Apostle Paul.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that gives you an idea. So when I say, right, it was broadly considered reliable in the ancient church, like to that level, it's not just that everybody thinks, oh yeah, that's a book to be read privately. There were people who thought it was part of the New Testament.
So since technically correct is the best kind of correct, technically speaking, in some places at certain times, this was a canonical book.
Yes.
Because it was treated that way. by
Yes.
certain churches. Yeah.
So it would be in the category of like the Deuterocanon of the Old Testament, where some local churches would do public readings from those books and others would not.
Yeah.
And Saint Hippolytus, so we're talking late 2nd century, references events that are recorded in the Acts of Paul as just events that happened, meaning he's not referencing the text. He's just referring to things as historical fact that our earliest written account of is in the Acts of Paul.
Yeah.
So that gives you an idea of that's part of the basis for what I say historically reliable. And we'll find this with some of the other texts we talk about tonight too. There are other places and people who refer to these events that we first hear about in terms of surviving texts. We first hear about in these books, right? But they're also attested to in these other outside places as being just events that happen. The first and frankly only really super negative thing we have about the Acts of Paul comes from Tertullian.
Well,
but it's not so much that he has a beef with the text as he has a beef with the existence of Saint Thecla.
I mean, Tertullian definitely had problems with women.
Yes.
To put it mildly.
He did not have a balanced view.
Yes.
So specifically in the text, Saint Thecla, and as you may know, even if you've never touched the Acts of Paul in your life, especially if you're going to an Antiochian church, right? You may have just heard the life of Saint Thecla, right, and stuff, right, and not know anything about the Acts of Paul, but know things about Saint Thecla, and that's where Tertullian's beef was. Saint Thecla, as a disciple of Saint Paul, is recorded as having preached to and baptized other women. So Tertullian had a problem with the idea that a woman would be allowed to preach to anyone or baptize anyone.
I mean, this is basically what the role of the deaconess in the early church kind
Right.
of was.
If you know anything about what deaconesses actually did in the early church, right, getting away from the present day nonsense, what deaconesses actually did, deaconesses who are mentioned in the Didache, who are mentioned, right, we know existed in the early church. What they did was preach and teach to other women and participate in the baptisms of other women, right? That's sort of exactly what they did. So from the perspective of the early church, right, there's kind of no problem with St. Thecla. Tertullian just was, you know, he left the church for the He-Man Woman Haters Club. No girls allowed. And except Montanus's 2 prophetesses that he traveled around with. But we won't, you know, hey, we won't throw any more shade there. Less said, the better. But this text, for example, when you're dealing with any text, so this is a text from the early 2nd century.
Wow.
So the early 100s.
Yeah.
And written in the western part of Asia Minor. And when you hear Western Asia Minor, when you're reading about ancient texts and you're reading about this kind of stuff, Western Asia Minor, you should think Ephesus.
Yeah, I mean, Western Asia, I mean, Asia Minor is kind of basically Turkey, modern Turkey.
Yes.
Roughly. I think I also wanted to say, by the way, that, you know, when you're thinking early 2nd century, when you're talking about that, we should remember that, like, the last book of the canonical New Testament is written in what, the 90s? The late 1st century. So you're talking
around
about
95, 96 Revelation.
Yeah. So this is a text that's from within just decades, just a few decades of the death of the last apostle.
Yeah. Ephesus gets destroyed later on, right? And that's why, and essentially in terms of church polity, gets replaced by Constantinople once it's founded, right? In that part of the world as the major Christian center. But if you read the canonical book of Acts, right, when St. Paul gives his farewell address, he gives his farewell address to the presbyters at Ephesus, right? Ephesus is the hub. St. John goes to Ephesus with the Theotokos. St. Mary Magdalene goes to Ephesus, right? This is in that part of the world, Ephesus was the hub, to the point that, assuming you're going to an Eastern Rite Orthodox church, the liturgy you celebrate every time you celebrate liturgy is a subspecies of the Ephesian liturgy.
Yeah, and I mean, and if history had turned out a little bit differently, Ephesus might well have been one of the pentarchy or hexarchy or whatever. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So, right, that Ephesus, when you were talking about this period in history, this very early period in church history, Ephesus is right there with Antioch and Alexandria and Jerusalem, right? And Rome is still getting started.
Yeah.
Really.
Yep.
They're latecomers. They're little brothers. Anyway, not sorry, Roman Catholic listeners. So, right. But so that's where it comes from. But, and they would have reason, as we were just saying, they would have reason to have living memory of information about St. Paul's life that hadn't necessarily been written down. St. Paul spent a lot of time in Ephesus and around Ephesus, right? And so they would have access to these traditions to compile them and put them into a text. But when you're looking at any text, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, again, just for reference, right? So here we are in 2026. You know, you and I were in our 20s, starting in the mid 90s.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the original mid 90s, that's when St. John is, writing the apocalypse and dying. And then these texts are basically from like the equivalent of now, but, 2000 years ago. So, I mean, I just want to kind of emphasize that for people. Like, this is the level of closeness in time. There's a lot of living people who would have remembered some of this stuff.
Yes. St. Paul was martyred about 50 years, give or take, before this was written.
Right.
Okay. So do you think you could put together...
That's when Monty Python and the Holy Grail came out.
Yeah.
Well, 51 years ago.
Yeah. But so do you think if you wanted to, you could put together a pretty good history of the year 1976?
Right.
Just by interviewing people who were alive at the time.
Right.
Obviously, yes.
Yeah.
Right. Obviously, this is within living memory. Right. There were still people alive who had met St. Paul at the time this was written.
Yeah.
This isn't some vast gulf of time for all these legends and weird things to grow up. Right.
Yeah.
But whenever we're talking about a 2nd century text, and even an early 3rd century text that's not canonical, you always end up having to answer the question, is this a Gnostic text? Right?
Yeah.
Because that is a big divide in terms of non-canonical texts written during this period. Even when we were introducing this a few minutes ago, when I was talking about the various St. James literature, I said some of it's Gnostic and some of it's not, right? So we have to ask that question, right? And that, is it Gnostic? If the answer is yes, that gives you a pretty good explanation right off the bat about why it's not in the Bible. But in this case, and in many other cases, the answer is no. It is not. In fact, the text at many points is very deliberately and directly anti-Gnostic. Right? So the text, and therefore, probably it seems that the major reason for writing down these traditions, it wasn't just like, hey man, we got a lot of people here who knew St. Paul and knew some interesting tidbits about him. Let's get that written down before these people die off, right? that doesn't seem to be what occasioned the compilation of this text. What seems to have occasioned the compilation of this text is actually the rise of Gnosticism, which they saw as opposed to the gospel that St. Paul had preached to them. And so they're wanting to clearly set out, here's who St. Paul was and here's what he taught, over against, right, these newfangled Gnostic so-and-sos coming around with their nonsense. So you could broadly divide the text of the Acts of Paul into either 3 or 4 parts. The middle part you could consider just to be a middle part, or you consider it to be 2 different things. We'll get to that in a second. But the first part, as we mentioned, is the Acts of Paul and Thecla, because St. Thecla takes up a lot of the quote-unquote screen time, as it were, right, in this part of the text. And so St. Thecla, the Acts of Paul is not our only source about the existence and life of St. Thecla by a long shot. Obviously, there are Syrian traditions surrounding the figure of St. Thecla, the monastery founded at a significant place in her life that we'll get to here in a minute when we get into the text. Feast day, pilgrimages surrounding her, right, that go deeply back into Christian history. One of the ways we know that this goes way back into Christian history is that we also have, in written form, Saint Evgenia, who's living in Rome. So the other side of the empire, the other side of the economos, the other side of the inhabited world. In AD 185, we have talking about Saint Thecla as a role model for Christian women.
Oh, wow. And I mean, all this just kind of underlines a point we've made a bunch of times, but I think it's worth reiterating, is that when we look at one of these texts from the early church, these texts are not the source of the traditions about whoever they're talking about. They are a witness to these traditions.
Yes.
You know, it's not like there's suddenly, you know, this text appears out of nowhere and then suddenly people say, oh, yes, those are the things that St. Paul did, you know. No, that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense. You know, this is not historical fiction. You know, this is a collection of traditions being written down, and this happens to be the text, the earliest text that we have that is extant. Because remember, most everything from, you know, most written stuff from the ancient world is gone. Most of it's gone. You know.
Right.
So this is just the earliest text that we have that bears witness to these traditions.
Yes.
Like the events and the traditions occur before the written stuff, just like the Gospels, right? Jesus does all those things, and then later on, you get these apostles writing down what he did.
Yes. Yes. So St. Thecla does not come from the Acts of Paul.
Right.
St. Thecla came from the womb of her mother into reality.
Yeah.
And existed on the earth. And lived and did things. That's the source. That's the original ultimate source. Right? The information about who she is and what she did made its way down to us many centuries later through various written and oral means. Right. But this is important because the way you express it, when you say that something came from a text, you are already implying that the text invented it.
Yeah.
That the text made it up. Right. And you shouldn't even use that language for the same reason when you're talking about the Bible, by the way. That comes from the Bible. Well, no, that comes from reality, and the Bible is maybe, you know, the primary place where that information was preserved for us down to the present day. but that's not where it comes from.
Right.
Right. That's
Right. Yeah.
yes. The revelation is Christ, not the Bible. The Bible is where that revelation that came in Christ is recorded. Yeah. Very important distinction. So by AD 185, knowledge of Saint Thecla in some detail about her life had literally made it from one end of the Roman Empire to the other, completely apart from this text, as far as we can tell. Now in the text, Saint Thecla is one of Saint Paul's first converts at the city of Iconium when he goes there on his first missionary journey. So this is kind of an overlap with the canonical Acts of the Apostles. And she follows him, then she travels, which is one of the people, of the several people who travels with him on his journey. As we mentioned, she evangelizes and assists with the baptisms of women, as St. Paul is preaching primarily to men. Once again, right, this is the first century. Synagogues were not integrated across gender lines. So this is what we would expect, right? This is what would be normal. Now, one of the very important things in terms of how this text presents Saint Thecla, and this will become a motif in hagiography of particularly female saints and martyrs going forward, is her decision to maintain her virginity, right? Which in the ancient world, in the time that she lived, was her deciding not to marry.
Yeah, which that's not a thing in the first
That's
century.
not a thing that women were allowed to do. Yes.
Yeah, it just not, it was just unthinkable.
But within the text, she is allowed to do it because she's making that decision in line with things we see St. Paul saying.
Yeah.
In his canonical epistles, so that she could devote herself to serving Christ entirely. Devote her whole life, continue traveling with St. Paul rather than being married, staying in one place, raising children, right? She wants to continue to travel, help spread the gospel, serve him, serve Christ with her whole life. Okay. Now that may not sound that crazy to us, right? But as Father Andrew pointed out, number one, that was a thing you were not allowed to do in the ancient world, even in the ancient Jewish world. Women did not have that right to say no to marriage for that or any reason. But also the Christian embrace of that idea. This is the beginning of the development of the whole idea of sexual consent as it has now come to exist in the modern world.
Yeah.
Right. And regardless of what you think the current state of that discourse is, right, until the coming of Christianity, there was no such concept. Right. It is very difficult to separate in ancient stories and ancient narratives, even when you're going through the Torah and some of the commandments, to separate consensual sexual relations from sexual assault.
Yeah.
Right. So when you see the word, here goes our modernization. I'll just kill it right now. When you see the word rape in ancient texts, like ancient Greek texts, right? There are several texts, famous paintings and stuff, the rape of this female character. Rape is not a concept that had something to do with consent. Rape was having sexual relations with someone either surreptitiously, like secretly, like because they were married to someone else, you were sneaking around, or under false pretenses. You were pretending to be a different person.
Well, and even the English word rape within, I mean, literally just within our lifetimes, it used to mean, I mean, it's often had the sexual sense to it, but it used to also have a very strong sense of just meaning to carry, especially carry a woman off, like the rape of the rape of the Sabine women was not what we would now call rape. It was carrying them off to forcibly marry them, but it was carrying them off,
Yes.
and so
taking them from their father without paying the dowry.
Right,
yes.
right. I mean, I remember, and I mean, just to illustrate that this change in English anyways has happened relatively recently. The longest running this may be the first time first in a long time we've mentioned Broadway musicals, but this is off Broadway. The longest running off Broadway musical for a long time was a show called The Fantastics. And in The Fantastics, there was a song called Rape, and it was not about sexual assault. It was about carrying a woman off. But recent productions of that show no longer include that song. Well, and they've changed. Yeah, in fact, now the song is called Abductions, and it's a completely different song, actually. Yeah.
Nirvana can't even sing about it on SNL.
No.
But yeah, so the idea of consent comes from this idea that comes with Christianity in particular, that women have the right to not get married in order to dedicate their lives to serving the Lord. And so this is of, I mean, obviously, if this is sinking in, this is of massive cultural importance, right? This is like a watershed in the development of what we think of as culture and morality, right, today. And it's something that comes from Christianity. So, and it's why, and then we'll move on, but it's why anybody who tells you that Christianity is misogynistic and acts like the pagan world loved women pre-Christianity, you should just laugh in their face and watch.
Yeah, it's exactly the opposite of true.
Because they know nothing, right? Yeah. It reminds me of this clip I just saw of Sean McDowell and friend of the show Bart Ehrman, where Sean McDowell was trying to argue that there is inbuilt into humanity this kind of basic moral compass.
Oh,
and friend of the show Bart Ehrman telling him he was full of it, and that almost all the stuff he thought was part of the general moral compass was actually a product of Christianity. That was just amazing. So
wow, someone needs to be Tom Holland built.
This is one of the Bart Ehrman's new book is like virtually a sequel to Dominion. But yeah, one of the many reasons he's friend of the show. Yeah, it's just this bizarre moment. We also have in the Acts of Paul our earliest physical description of St. Paul. I referenced this in my book on St. Paul, and I'm sure I've referenced it on the show before. This is where it actually is in the Acts of Paul. And again, this is about circa 50 years after his death. And we have good reason to believe that this physical description is accurate for, I think, two primary reasons. Number one, it matches our earliest iconography of St. Paul. And number two, it is very unflattering. So, like, if you were going to make up something about this figure, like the Acts of Paul, they love St. Paul. They think St. Paul's great. They want you to know how great an apostle St. Paul was. And then they describe him physically. and it's super unflattering, you probably got to figure they're being honest, right? Like,
Yeah.
they could have cut him a break otherwise. So, and to give you an idea of how unflattering, they said he had really large, watery eyes, a very large, pronounced nose. His eyebrows met in the middle.
Unibrow.
Yes, he was nearly completely bald. He was bandy-legged, meaning like bow-legged, and he walked awkwardly. He had
guy.
big knobby knees.
Poor guy.
Now, you can imagine some of that was the result of being, beaten and shipwrecked and all the stoned and all the things he went through. But again, and if based on these other factors, we consider this to be broadly accurate, it makes sense of a lot of things he says in his canonical epistles, like talking about how there was nothing about him in terms of his physical presence, right? And rhetorical skill that would in and of itself win people over to his cause, right? He's not exactly an Adonis, right? This is not somebody who he's not Saul from the Old Testament, who is a head taller than everybody else, right? And like strapping, and everyone wants him to be king. Saul of Tarsus was kind of the other end of the physical spectrum. And so, but that again shows you it's his message, it's what he's saying, it's what he's preaching, right? That is important, right? And that was captivating people. We then get the story of St. Thecla's suitors, who, given that she wasn't allowed to say no in the ancient world, didn't want to take no for an answer in terms of marrying her. Yeah. And so chased her to a large rock. Which rock opened up in front of her and hid her in an area with a spring of water.
And you can
so
still go there.
Kept safe. And that is Malula. Yeah.
Ma'alula, Father. Ma'alula.
Yeah, okay. Fake your accent. That's fine.
I'm just saying.
I'm a white boy. I don't have that accent.
I know. I am also white, but I did marry into a vast Middle Eastern world.
So that's.
But yeah, you can go there. It's there in Syria.
I'm not saying it's an affectation. I'm just saying, it's not something I do.
It's an adaptation.
So, right, yeah. So that is still there, still a place that you could go.
Yeah.
And then the last bit, and this is not exactly historical fiction, but it's not, it's definitely not historical fact in the modern sense either. The last bit of the first part of the Acts of Paul tells a story that is very clearly borrowed. It's a story that everyone at the time, everyone in the early 2nd century had heard before. Probably a lot of our listeners have heard before, even if they've never read the Acts of Paul. And that is St. Paul meets a lion. And this lion has an injured paw.
Yeah.
That's making him upset. So St. Paul helps him with the injured paw, helps him out, heals him, then preaches the gospel to him and baptizes the lion. There's a twist.
As one does.
Right. And then they go their separate ways. And then later on, St. Paul gets thrown to the lions for preaching the gospels. And guess who one of the lions turns out to be?
It's the Christian lion.
It's the Christian lion.
Yeah.
And fortunately for St. Paul, that doesn't mean he just blesses his meal. He refrains from eating St. Paul, being a Christian lion. It's sort of like that scene from Thor Ragnarok with the Hulk. But so he doesn't eat. Now, those of you with a little bit of classical education may recognize the story of Androcles and the lion.
Yeah.
Like pretty instantly. And you're not wrong. right? You're not wrong. So this is taking a story that would have been this is not plagiarism, because all of the original readers would be familiar with this story.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, this would be like if I was writing a story and I insert into the story I'm writing that the main character gets bitten by a radioactive spider and can now stick to walls. Okay. Plagiarism would not be a correct charge, because it'd be like, dude, I know everybody has heard of Spider-Man, right? Like, I was trying to allude to Spider-Man. That was the whole point, right? I was making a Spider-Man reference. So this is the text making an Androcles and the Lion reference.
Yeah.
And so when you see something like this, when you see a sub-reference, now I feel like I'm telling people how to interpret the things I say. But anyway, when you hear a sub-reference, and it's not on Family Guy, because Family Guy is lame. I said it. It's lame. It's always been lame. Their sub-references go nowhere, right? Like, it's manatees. We've known this. So when someone makes a sub-reference, when there's intertextuality like this, the first thing you want to look at is not what is the thing being referenced or what are the things in common. That's the mistake. Oh, look, this is just Androcles and the Lion. Look, forget about it.
Or I mean, and I was gonna say, and I mean, I don't. I'm not saying, making accusation of bad faith here, but also like the person in the chat who said, "Wait, can the church still baptize animals?" I'm like, no, that's not what this story is about.
Yeah, we'll get there. It's a little too fast.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, I already said this to you, Father Andrew. Like, do not take this the wrong way, guys.
Right.
I do not need a line 35 deep of middle-aged women and their cats looking for baptisms at the church tomorrow.
Although, as another person pointed out in the chat, trying to baptize a cat would be pretty exciting.
Oh, no, I do not need that. The blood. You can't have that much blood in the church, right? So, yeah, you would never immerse a cat 3 times. One, maybe if you surprised it, but then you're done, right? Like,
I mean, first you have to put them in a sack, and then no, sorry.
Wow, you took it again, taking it to a dark place. First, the horrors of the Second World War. Now you're drowning cats. Like, what has happened during this move, Father Andrew? Who hurt you?
I finally snapped after all these years of talking to you, man.
You're going to turn into me. Yeah.
That's right.
So you want to look for the differences, right? And the main difference, as people have correctly noted, is St. Paul here preaches the gospel to, and then baptizes the lion. Which obviously that part doesn't happen in Androcles and the Lion. Okay.
Right.
So the overarching structure of Androcles and the Lion has been borrowed in order to send us a message about the idea that salvation, the salvation that comes in Christ, extends not just to humans, but to the whole of creation. And why Androcles and the Lion? Well, a lion is a wild animal. It is an unclean animal. It is a non-domesticated animal, right? A fierce animal that potentially will eat a person, right? And so it is sort of an element of the created order that is perhaps the most hostile to man, right? But God's love, his saving love, extends even to, right, that creature, that part of the created order. Okay? Now, again, this doesn't mean we're going to go around baptizing animals, right? If you want to go and preach the gospel to a herd of sheep or cows, go ahead. It works really well. Take it from a Dutchman. It works really well with cows. They will just stand there and stare at you while you preach for hours at a time. Same sometimes happens in Dutch churches, but that's a whole other thing. But what's the point then? If the text isn't telling us we should go baptize animals, what's the point of having this law get baptized? What's the point of arguing this? Well, who would you be arguing that against in the early part of the 2nd century? You'd be arguing that against various Gnostic sects. Because what is one of the basic beliefs of a sect that would cause us to identify it as Gnostic? It's that the created order is itself in some way evil.
Yeah, or needs to be transcended or something like that.
Is evil, and so you're saved out of it. You're saved from it. Okay? And so, again, we have a lion, a creature that is hostile to humanity, right? So if you're going to peg something as evil, if you're going to talk about even just nature red in tooth and claw, right? Even that level of evil, right? A lion's a pretty good symbol for that. Right?
Yeah.
And so the text is here using this partially borrowed narrative element to communicate to us, right, that the whole created order finds its salvation in Christ and through the gospel of Jesus Christ. Even the parts that may seem the most hostile to humanity are not actually evil in that they are part of God's creation.
Yeah, I mean, God said that it was good.
Yes. And now you may think, okay, well, yeah, but you're just importing this whole anti-Gnostic thing in. But that now brings us to section 2 of the Acts of Paul. And section 2, or possibly 2 and 3, if you want to divide these, section 2 is made up of 2 letters, 2 epistles that aren't canonical epistles of St. Paul, but 2 epistles. And the subject of these 2 epistles is Gnosticism. So that's literally where the narrative segues into the letters about Gnosticism. So, I think it's pretty fair, right, contextually, to see the connection there. Now, these 2 letters are not 2 letters from St. Paul. One of them is a letter to St. Paul from the church at Corinth. That's the first one. And then the second one is St. Paul's response back to the church at Corinth. Okay. And someone may think, well, wait, if you know anything about, if you've read recently 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you know that there were other letters. That there was at least one letter that St. Paul sent to Corinth before 1 Corinthians. That there was probably one in between, right? You know that there are these sort of quote-unquote missing letters of St. Paul to Corinth. St. Paul also refers to letters he had received from them. So you might think, oh, are these 2 letters in the Acts of Paul 2 of those letters that are missing from the New Testament? Answer, no. And it's not just me saying no, they're not presented as that.
Yeah.
They're presented as this is a separate mail exchange. This is a separate email thread from the canonical epistles, right? This is a whole separate set of correspondence. That's how it's presented in the Acts of Paul. So the Acts of Paul is not claiming that these fit back in between the canonical epistles. The Acts of Paul is presenting these as a second follow-up thing. Okay? And so the first letter, the letter from Corinth, basically they lay out the problem. The problem is these 2 wandering presbyters have shown up. Not that anything like this would ever happen today. They've shown up. They're preaching some kind of weird sounding stuff, right? That sounds like it contradicts the stuff that St. Paul had taught them. And so they're asking St. Paul, hey, here's the stuff they're teaching. Is this right? Should we receive them? Should we let them preach this stuff? Or should we throw them out? Right? Yeah. And call them anathema, right? And the two main things that the letter says that they're teaching is, number one, that the cosmos, right, the world, the cosmos, is evil and was created by lesser angels, not by God. So there's one big Gnostic red flag, right? And seems related to Marcionism that would have been going around at this time, right? Old Testament God is a lesser God, right? Created evil creation, or at least bad creation. They've got a Platonic metaphysics, so lesser means bad, right? Lesser means evil, in that kind of metaphysics. And then they're going to be out after strike two. Strike two is they're teaching that Jesus was not actually incarnate as flesh and blood. And this, of course, is related because flesh and blood, the material creation, is evil.
Yeah, if you're a Gnostic, you don't believe in the incarnation. That would be crazy.
Right. That would defeat the whole purpose, right?
Yeah.
Us being, you and I being incarnate is the problem, according to Gnostics. So as one might anticipate, St. Paul sends his letter back to Corinth saying, no, these guys are anathema, throw them out, have nothing to do with them. Pop them one upside the head for me. That last one, not literally. But have nothing to do with them, right? Throw them out. So this is what we meant when we said the text is clearly anti-Gnostic, and this is sort of introduced by the episode with the lion. So then after these two letters, the last part of the Acts of Paul is the martyrdom of St. Paul. St. Paul goes to Rome. He stands trial before Nero, and Nero has a cupbearer, a servant who's his good friend. They're close pals, named Patroclus.
Okay.
If you have a classical education, who was Achilles' close pal and really good friend. Patroclus falls over dead. You're going to get the idea from these non-canonical acts we read tonight that people are really fragile in the 2nd century. It does not take a lot to kill a person in the 2nd century. But Patroclus falls over dead. St. Paul, right, works a miracle, raises Patroclus from the dead, intending to use this as an opportunity to now preach the gospel to Nero and try to convert him to Christianity. Nero, however, is just scared. Right? Nero sees this St. Paul raise a guy from the dead and is like, oh no, he's going to use his magic powers to overthrow me and take over the empire. I need to kill this guy. And so Nero begins his persecution of Christians, and he orders St. Paul beheaded. And in the telling of the Acts of Paul, when St. Paul's head is severed, the stem of his neck pours out milk instead of blood.
That's wild.
Yes. But the idea here is that this is milk, as in this is a reference back to his teachings.
Yeah, that even his death is nourishing.
Yes.
Sort of thing. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's the idea of the symbolism. There are other traditions in other places about the details of St. Paul's death. Everywhere he's beheaded. He's beheaded under Nero. Beheading is how you were executed if you were a Roman citizen. Roman citizens could not be crucified. Crucifixion was considered barbaric and horrible. That's why they only did it to barbarians and known persona, slaves, etc. So St. Paul, as a Roman citizen, had the right to be beheaded instead, which was considered a mercy. There is a church in Rome where this happened, that you could go to this day. St. Paul's relics were interred near there. St. Paul's relics have relatively recently they ran all the scientific tests. Now you can't prove that this is St. Paul, right? It's not like we have a St. Paul DNA record to compare it to, but that did demonstrate that it was a first century Jewish man who had been beheaded, buried there, and that he was wearing first century Palestinian textiles.
Well, who could that possibly be?
Yes. So
yeah.
It's been confirmed as far as you can confirm it. The detail of the milk, right, is the main thing that's ascribable to the text in particular, and that's an interpretation, right? That's a symbolic interpretation of St. Paul's death that is telling us something about St. Paul's death. That St. Paul was beheaded under Nero is a very firmly established fact of history.
Yeah.
So that's where the Acts of Paul ends.
All right.
We're just getting started. And
we are just getting started.
Really crazy stuff is yet to come.
Yet to come. So that wraps up the first half of this episode of the Lord of Spirits podcast, and we'll be right back after this short break.
Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung will be back in a moment to take your calls on the next part of the Lord of Spirits. Give them a call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Ancient Near Eastern texts such as the Baal cycle portray the pagan god Baal as a rebel, the hero of a revolution, worshipped and glorified for his long string of victories. In the Baal book, a biography of the devil, Father Stephen DeYoung shows that the Hebrew scriptures consciously turn the Baal story on its head, depicting him as a failed and defeated rebel who nonetheless tries to steal the glory that belongs to Almighty God. From these scriptures, the figure of the devil emerged within Jewish and Christian tradition. Father Stephen works through the Old and New Testament passages that refer to various Baal stories, and he surveys Baal worship through followers' beliefs, religious practices, and liturgical life to show that the figures of Baal and the devil, the prince of demons, are one and the same. You can find the Baal book at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back now with the Lord of Spirits, with Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung. If you have a question, call now at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. It's the second half of this episode on, should I say uncanonical, non-canonical, extra-canonical?
Sub-canonical? Extra-canonical?
Super
Supra-canonical?
Meta-canonical text about the apostles.
Books to be read in the church parking lot.
Yeah, there we go. Yes. Only readable in the narthex, or the exo-narthex.
Yes. I'm not sure if
so
that was a commercial break or a visit to a Belgian discotheque. But,
and that was the voice of Simon, everybody, by the way. Yeah.
I really like Simon's drawings.
Nice.
That's what I have to say about it.
Nice. Yes. So anyway, so we talked about the Acts of Paul, which also, of course, includes a subsection of that is the Acts of St. Paul and St. Thecla. St. Thecla, the proto-martyr among women, super beloved in the Antiochian church, but universally beloved throughout the whole Orthodox Church. But like, we double, quadruple, triple, hextuple down on our veneration of St. Thecla in the Antiochian church. She's
like a fifth class saint on the Russian calendar.
Really?
Yeah, she's like the third or fourth one listed on that day.
Russian brothers and sisters, sit down for a moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Need to have a talk.
She does have
to align yourself with the chair of St. Peter in Antioch. That's right.
That's right. The successor of Peter, you guys.
Speaking of Peter.
Yeah, that was a good segue.
Yeah.
We haven't actually gotten any on-topic phone calls yet, so and no one knows
who cares about on topic.
And no one said the secret word either. So,
yeah. If you want to call in about baptizing cats, like we could.
I mean, that's true.
We could go there. I will not baptize that movie.
There was some dude in the chat who wanted to debate. He wanted to tell us that Trinitarian theology was false. So he had to be put in timeout. But anyway. Well, I thought someone would call since I made that big pitch there, but I guess Mike has just taken the evening off. I don't know.
That could be too.
Yep. All right. Well, St. Paul.
Not that many questions about St. Paul and Thecla. Don't worry. We'll give you stuff to talk about this half.
How about that brother of St. Andrew, everybody? He's interesting.
St. Andrew's little bro. Yeah.
That's right. Did you notice that the icon that I picked for this episode, St. Andrew, is right in the middle? Yes.
People are just gonna think you're one of those EP papalists. That's what they're gonna think.
No.
You're trying to.
That's all legend.
Okay.
Anyway.
So yes. So now we're gonna turn to the Acts of Peter. And St. Peter, slightly important figure in the early church. Right?
Indeed.
He looks for a hot minute like he might be the main character of the Acts of the Apostles. And if you were the sort of person who thought that St. Peter was just taking over for Jesus after the end of the Gospel of St. Luke, you'd expect him to be the main character for the whole book of the Acts of the Apostles, even though he isn't. But he sort of, as you know, if you've actually read the Acts of the Apostles, he kind of frankly disappears. Right?
Basically, not very Vicar Christi, is he?
Yeah, he disappears. He pops up again at the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, which he doesn't chair and doesn't issue the final statement on. I
mean, we love St. Peter, but
submits himself to the council and its authority. But then he sort of disappears again for the rest of the book of Acts. So the Acts of Peter, we know from a bunch of things, including his epistles, that he goes to Rome. And so the Acts of Peter is a text that collects some very early traditions about St. Peter from Rome and its environs, the Christian communities, the churches there. So St. Photius the Great actually believed that the Acts of Paul and the Acts of Peter had the same author when he did his catalog of the library at Constantinople, which is a thing he did that maybe people don't know about. But we now don't think that's the case. We can see what he was looking at, right? So he was just looking at the two texts, and the Greek and that kind of thing is very similar. Right. So he was going based on the style and kind of the syntax.
Yeah.
But it's now clear, based on some other things, we have more manuscripts from different places, some different things, that and in different languages, that the Acts of Peter was written later in the 2nd century. So it's not impossible that whoever compiled the Acts of Paul 50 years later also compiled the Acts of Peter. That's not impossible. But it seems less likely than that there is a second author.
Yeah.
So as we said, this is a compilation of traditions about St. Peter, a number of the traditions that are recorded here, particularly surrounding his death. We have other independent sources with basically the same information, just as we did with the Acts of Paul. Acts of Peter was incredibly popular as a text in the ancient church because we have multiple copies in sort of all of the major languages, right, that you would have this stuff in. So it's originally in Greek, but we've also got Latin, Coptic, Armenian, Ethiopic, Syriac, right, just across the board, multiple copies, all these different translations, all these different languages. That's part of what lets us kind of hone in on better on exactly when it was written and when these translations were made, because we're not just working from one version of the text or one copy. As we mentioned, any text from the 2nd century, even though this is later in the 2nd century, any text from the 2nd century, you got to ask, is it Gnostic?
Yeah.
Answer is no, because it is very clearly anti-Gnostic. We will see, as we saw with the Acts of Paul, it is not ambivalent in any way about Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is actually represented by a figure in the narrative, that figure being Simon Magus, who we'll talk about more here in a couple of minutes. So it begins, the Acts of Peter begins with St. Peter arriving in Rome. He travels there with his family, with his wife and kids, who are alluded to within the canonical New Testament. So in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 5, remember, St. Paul says that he would have the right to take a wife and children with him in his travels the way Cephas and the other apostles did. So he specifically mentioned St. Peter as having a wife and children and traveling with them. And of course, famously in St. Luke's Gospel, chapter 4, verses 38 through 40, Christ healed St. Peter's mother-in-law, which kind of requires you to have a wife.
Right.
Insert old school mother-in-law joke here about how she's a real battle axe or something similar. But that old Henny Youngman material and Buddy Hackett, we gotta bring some of that stuff back. So the Acts of Peter begins with them arriving in Rome, and then we get this episode, which one of the themes you've probably gleaned already tonight, and that you're going to continue to glean, is that when people interpret these texts, people tend to interpret them with weird agendas.
Yeah.
Right? So here's what happens in the text, and then we'll talk about interpreting it, right? So what happens in the text is Roman pagan guy, wants to marry St. Peter's daughter.
Okay.
St. Peter doesn't want her to get married, so he prays that God will paralyze her. He prays, God paralyzes his daughter. Roman pagan dude says, nah.
Yeah.
I don't want to marry her.
She's damaged.
Paralyzed woman. So he moves on. St. Peter prays again. God cures her paralysis. Okay. So that's what happens in the text. Most modern scholarly interpreters you find will use this episode as evidence, and I'm not joking or exaggerating, that early Christians hated sex and thought it was evil.
I mean, just think about the layers of that, even besides from what I know you're about to say, which is like, here's a guy who's married, right?
Yes.
St. Peter is married, not into clerical celibacy,
and
married,
has children. So he has done
children,
the deed.
Right? Like even just that by itself. Yeah.
Yes. Right.
But also,
so you can see from this that Christians would rather see their children be crippled than get married and have sexual relations.
Yeah.
Okay. So, what are the details that they're leaving out that you get if you read the Acts of Peter closely? Well, here's the first important detail. St. Peter's daughter is 10.
Huh. That kind of changes the picture just a little bit.
10 years old.
Which, I mean, you know, not to play devil's advocate for the Romans, but Romans would have had no problem with that.
Right. So if you understand the social setting at the time, St. Peter is not a Roman citizen, nor is his daughter, meaning a Roman man could take a 10-year-old Jewish girl as a sex slave anytime he wanted to.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So what St. Peter here is trying to prevent is not his daughter settling down with a nice man and having a family. He's trying to prevent her being trafficked into underage sex slavery.
Especially with a pagan Roman.
Yes, with a pagan Roman. Well, a Christian Roman, one would think, would not be so much.
No.
Into the underage sex slavery. One would hope, at least. Right? And so, societally, St. Peter had no means to prevent this. He couldn't go to a court, be like, Your Honor, I don't want him to take my 10-year-old daughter.
I mean, who's St. Peter? St. Peter is not even like St. Paul. He's not a Roman citizen. He's literally non-persona as far as the Romans are concerned.
Yes. So him praying and having something happen to his daughter that caused the Roman to lose interest and move on, that's the only way St. Peter has to prevent this horrible thing from happening. Okay? And yes, the language is used in his prayer that St. Peter wants to preserve her from sin. That's not the sin of getting married and having kids, quote unquote.
Right.
Like that's a sin. It's the sin of her being like defiled by a pagan Roman adult when she's 10.
Yeah.
He wants that not to happen to his daughter.
Which, I mean, that's just called good parenting.
Yes, that's called being a dad. Okay?
Right.
Like,
yeah.
Okay, so, yes, right? So, and the reason I'm spending time on this, right, is I know we like headlines, okay? You know how I know we like headlines? Because I have made a mistake a few times in my life of reading YouTube comments. And so I've seen all of you commenting on videos with me in them. And by that, I mean commenting on the title of videos with me in them.
Yeah. Right.
We like headlines, okay? Right?
It's the cardinal sin of the internet, people commenting without reading or listening or watching.
But most people aren't going to ever, even people into this show, I know most of the people who listen to this will probably never sit down and read the Acts of Peter in full, okay? So if anybody knows anything about the Acts of Peter, if anybody knows anything about these texts, it's usually from some documentary they watched.
Yeah. Which often
and the soundbite about this in the documentary is going to be somebody with PhD after their name saying, we know from this that Christians thought sex was innately evil.
Yeah.
Right? You're going to accept their summary of it without investigating. We have to do that. We can't investigate everything, right? No one has enough time to study everything they're told in detail to verify every single thing. No one can do that, right? And so we end up just accepting a lot of this stuff, right? But when it comes to matters of spiritual importance, about the teachings of Christianity and stuff, you can't just accept these sound bites, right? You can't just accept these characterizations because you don't have to push very hard. You only have to read enough to find out that his daughter is 10 and you kind of know that their whole narrative falls apart, right? Like that something else is going on here, right? So, yes. So that is the story of, through St. Peter's prayers, God rescuing his daughter from being horribly violated, by a pagan Roman. Okay.
Which, good job, Peter.
Yes. Right. And thank you, God, right, for doing that. Okay. So after this, we get a little more into the meat of St. Peter's stay in Rome and his rivalry with Simon Magus, who we mentioned. So
dun, dun,
Simon
dun.
Magus, yeah.
I was just saying, dun, dun, dun.
Oh, okay. Yes, the official. Simon Magus, of course, shows up in the canonical Acts of the Apostles, tries to pay for the ability to bestow the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
For the disciples.
The original Simony.
Magus is not his last name. It's the idea that he's a sorcerer. Okay,
mage.
Involved in magical practices, pagan magical practices in the day. So as he appears here in Rome, he has not learned his lesson. So Simon Magus is here in the text presented as sort of the archetype of Gnosticism. We know historically that Gnosticism was made up of a bunch of different cults and groups and sects in different parts of the world that had their own origins. But like Simon Magus is here he's the figure who represents sort of all of them within this narrative, right? If we could we've combined several historical characters into this one character for the sake of narrative. And so St. Peter is traveling around in Rome. He's doing miracles. He's baptizing people, making them Christians, right? The church is growing. At the same time, Simon Magus is traveling around in Rome, and he's using a combination of sorcery and fakery, not in the fakir Hindu religion sense, but in the sleight of hand bogus sense, to begin sort of effectively a cult that is Gnosticism, right? A Gnostic cult. And this culminates in St. Peter and Simon Magus are going to sort of have a wizard duel. And by wizard duel, I mean, it's deliberately evoking like Moses and the sorcerers or the wizards or magicians in Pharaoh's court, right? Like Janus and Jambres. We're going to have this showdown between St. Peter and Simon Magus. And Simon Magus, sort of for his ultimate trick, when he decides to pull out all the stops, he takes off into the air and he's flying around over the city of Rome, right? You'll believe a man can fly, right? So he's doing that shtick to show his powers, and St. Peter prays, and Simon Magus crashes and burns and gets mangled. And it literally describes him getting mangled. Like a whole bunch of pagan Roman doctors run over and they're all trying to save his life and fix him. But no, he's wrecked. St. Peter wins, flawless victory. And so then after that comes one of the most famous traditions about St. Peter that there is. Outside of the text of the New Testament, which we have testified to a whole bunch of other places as well as the Acts of Peter, and that is what is often called the whole Quo Vadis story or the Quo Vadis incident. St. Peter hears that Nero's persecution is beginning. Those people who he's been preaching to and baptizing to are starting to be persecuted, jailed, killed. And so St. Peter gets ready. They come to him and tell him, oh, this is happening. St. Peter, you're one of the leaders. They're going to be after you. You got to get out of here. So he packs up and he starts to leave. And as he's leaving Rome on the road, he sees Christ carrying his cross going the other way, going back into the city. And St. Peter says to him, famously, Domini quo vadis, Lord, where are you going, in Latin. And Christ says that he is going to be crucified again in the city of Rome. And St. Peter sort of realizes if he leaves during this persecution, if he goes and he hides, he'll be doing it again. He'll be repeating his denial of Christ. And so he can't do that. He turns around, he goes back into the city. He stays with his people during the persecution. He ends up getting arrested. He ends up getting crucified. And he gets crucified famously upside down, inverted.
Which is why the St. Peter cross looks like a regular cross, but just upside down.
Yeah. And that is not historically odd, actually. The Romans, especially Roman centurions, were real sickos. Like literally. They would get bored. And so they would crucify people in what they thought were interesting ways all the time. Upside down, sideways, backwards. Right. Just to kind of amuse themselves, because they were bored at killing all these people. And sometimes the Romans would crucify hundreds of people at a time. Like during Spartacus's rebellion and stuff. So, horrible torture and murder, I guess, gets dull after the 150th time. So they would do things like this. So, and the fact of St. Peter's death in Rome by crucifixion, and even some of the other details, is testified to by St. Clement, St. Ignatius of Antioch, St. Irenaeus, Tertullian, Eusebius, whole bunch of other independent accounts, right? So the source of that fact is not the Acts of Peter. In fact, since we told you the Acts of Peter is written toward the end of the 2nd century, several of those figures, like St. Clement, St. Ignatius, St. Irenaeus, are writing before that.
Yeah.
Right. So this is just a known thing. And of course, there is the illusion within St. John's Gospel about St. Peter stretching out his arms, going where he does not want to go. And that being a reference to the manner of his death.
Yeah.
So, it's real special pleading to try and argue that this didn't happen. Sorry, Protestant friends who are inclined to make that argument. You're trying to ice skate uphill. That's all I'm saying. So much for the Acts of Peter. Do we have any Acts of Peter calls?
We don't. I don't know. Everyone is either enthralled or just, dumbfounded. So
Dumbfounded, bored to tears. I don't know.
That could be it too.
Old hat. Okay. Well, I heard people were getting bored, so now we're up in the ante. We're going all in.
All right.
Whatever you think of this next one, it ain't boring, my friend. And any hopes at monetization on this video are gone by the time we're done with the Acts of John.
Oh, boy.
I just rhymed that. It's pretty impressive.
Nice.
So the Acts of John, in addition to being just a wild ride, as we'll see, becomes important in large part due to the it becoming a point of argumentation in the Seventh Ecumenical Council. You may not have seen that coming, unless you're Michael Garton, in which case you saw it coming. We'll come back to, once we're done talking about what's in the text, we'll come back to the Seventh Ecumenical Council and why it became important there. But so, like the other ones we've been talking about, right? Acts of John is a collection of St. John traditions. It is a text from the mid-2nd century. So in between the Acts of Paul and the Acts of Peter, around circa 150 AD, you get the Acts of John.
Right when St. Justin Martyr is writing.
Yes.
Yeah.
You get the original composition of the Acts of John. We're going to talk about that in a second. And so that means that, and it's also from Western Asia Minor, code for Ephesus, where St. John was also active.
Yeah.
Right? And we're also talking about within about 50 years of St. John's death. Okay, so these are like his spiritual grandchildren are the ones who are recording these traditions. Okay. Do you think somebody's grandchildren are kind of a reliable witness to stories about their grandparents? In general, yes.
Yeah.
Right? In general, I would say yes. So there is the original text in Greek. And then there's a chunk of text that gets inserted into the text.
So how do they know that? How do they know that this, is it a radically different style? Is it because of the content?
They don't. We're just guessing. No.
Oh, okay.
So, no, we know that for a whole bunch of reasons. So the writing style is completely different. The vocabulary is completely different in this added section. It's a different genre.
Yeah.
Right. So up until this added section begins, it's like narrative telling us these stories in St. John's life. And then all of a sudden, at the beginning of what's now chapter 87, right, St. John just kind of like turns toward camera like Jim on The Office and
shrugs,
starts talking to the reader.
Oh, that's fun.
Right? And he does that until the end of chapter 105, and then it goes back to third-person narrative.
Yeah.
So you get this weird like address to the reader. It's got a completely different vocabulary. It's got a completely different Greek style from much later. And the theology in it is kooky. Such that, and so we know that there was a version of the Acts of John that was used by the Manichees. Right? And suspiciously, the weird theology of this inserted chunk kind of matches theirs. So to give you a couple of examples,
and by the way,
this address to the reader.
The Manichees was the weird heretical group that St. Augustine belonged to before he became a Christian.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's probably the touch, the touching point that most people would have in their heads. If
yeah. Maybe we'll do an episode someday about the Manichees.
That would be fun.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
They have 3 Christs, only one of whom is Jesus of Nazareth. So in this weird inserted address to the reader, St. John says, hey, sometimes we try to touch Jesus and he was tangible and you could touch him. And then other times our hands would just pass right through him. Apropos of nothing, let me just
I would say
on this.
Isn't this the apostle that's that which we have
leaned on his breast?
Leaned on his breast.
See, it would be funnier if he said he fell over, right? Like if we just went to prop comedy with the Gnostics, right? And he also he retells the story of the Transfiguration, and he leaves out the whole thing with Moses and Elijah being there.
Yeah.
You're going to go, do you not like the Old Testament for some reason? Little sus, right?
Yeah.
So for all those reasons, it's pretty clear that this is an insertion, right? Yeah. Syntax doesn't match. Vocab doesn't match. Genre doesn't match. Theology doesn't match, right? Like, in terms of the content. We know a group with that weird theology was using a version of the text centuries after it was written. Right?
By the way, speaking of texts, that's not a good segue. But yes, speaking of apocryphal text
from a Manichean.
I don't. No. We actually have a caller who has a question about some of this stuff. So let's just put him on through. So, Paul, welcome to Lord of Spears podcast. Christ is risen.
He's risen indeed. Thank you very much for having me, fathers.
Is this phone call technically one of the acts of Paul?
A lesser Paul, but sure.
Okay.
Yeah. This is a Paul in Texas.
So I wanted to ask, I don't have any particular questions based on what y'all covered so far. And I wanted to tell y'all that maybe it's because maybe a bunch of the listeners tonight are like me, where they just don't know enough about this to even like have a question yet.
Yeah, that
so
could
we're
be.
just digesting it all.
Yeah, I hear you.
Like I had nothing prepared because I'm not familiar with any of these texts yet. But I do have a question in relation to Apocrypha in general, but like this would include the Old Testament stuff. So I was Orthodox for 3 years, thank God, on Holy Saturday. And in the entire time, it's only really in the Lord of Spirits kind of online community that I've seen like a general kind of affinity for the apocryphal texts. Whereas in the standard Orthodox world that I've encountered thus far, it still seems that there's a kind of like what's the word I'm looking for? Aversion to it. I wanted to ask what the reason for that is, because some of the people I've heard talk about it, particularly in regards to the Book of Enoch, it seems like it's more than just like, convertitis or something, like a holdout that we brought over from the Protestant world. And it seems like there are some people that think that the patristic teaching on a lot of these texts is it's better to stay away as opposed to just reading it in private.
Yeah.
And I'm confused by that.
Well, I mean, the first thing that I'll say is I'm not just trying to sell a book here. It was written for this purpose. I do recommend Father Stephen's book, which is called Apocrypha, which treats a lot of this stuff in detail and gives a framework for understanding it. But I think here's the thing. A lot of what's in these texts is in the church. It's in the saints' lives. It's in our hymns. Right. It simply is digested, right? Largely without pointing at a text. It's the same content in many cases that's being represented. So, I do think, honestly, in some cases, I do think it is a kind of culturally Protestant attitude. And here's why. Like, one of the things that Father Stephen puts in that book is when he's, correct me if I'm wrong about this, Father, but I mean, like when you were picking your table of contents, like which texts you were going to talk about, Father Stephen chose Saint Nicephorus, Patriarch of Constantinople, his list of books that he said are profitable to read, but are not considered canonical texts. In other words, not read aloud as scripture in church. Mm-hmm. So this is a Patriarch of Constantinople and a saint who says this. And it's like almost a millennium later. I can't remember when is Saint Nicephorus? Is he 9th century, Father? 10th?
Beginning of the 9th century.
Beginning of the 9th century. So this is like triumph of orthodoxy era, right? The roughly the time when the events that get celebrated on Sunday of Orthodoxy, which happened in 843, as I recall. So that same era, right? And so he is pointing and saying, yeah, these are good books to read. They're not Bible, but they're good books to read, in a certain context, right? So I think part of it is just that English-speaking Orthodox Christianity, and I mean, I don't know what other languages you read or understand, Paul, but English-speaking Orthodox Christianity is still kind of appropriating, consciously talking about the whole Orthodox tradition, if that makes sense. But like I said, I mean, these things they're in the texts of our liturgical hymns. A lot of these same traditions are in the lives of saints. Like we just said, for instance, St. Peter is crucified upside down. If you've ever read the life of St. Peter, that's always mentioned. Whatever version of the life that you read. Or like, the traditions that we have about St. Thecla. This is the big witness that we have to those traditions. It's not the only one, but it's the big one. St. Thecla is a saint of the church. She celebrated on September 24th. Her Apologetian references her learning from St. Paul. Like, this is all there. It's all represented there. It's just that most of the time when you're doing catechesis, your priest is probably not going to say, and now let's read the Acts of Paul and Thecla, It's just, if you talk about Saint Thecla, what's known about her life will be mentioned, and it just so happens it's the same stuff that's in that text. So that's my take on it. I mean, I don't know, Father, did you want to add, subtract, multiply, divide, anything?
Yeah, well, so I think there's broadly two main arguments against considering this stuff. So this stuff, inarguably, as Father Andrew was saying, it's part of our tradition, right? Like, we did an episode on the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. I mean, that's preserved at Mount Athos, right? Like,
yeah,
it's incontrovertible that this is part of our Orthodox tradition, okay? But so in terms of emphasis, how much emphasis it receives, I think there's a good argument and a bad argument, right? And I want to be fair and give both, okay? The argument that I think is fair, and this argument you might hear from another person who hosts a show about the scriptures on ancient faith, right? Who I think has a little bit of an issue with how much we talk. We talk about this stuff a lot less than people think on Lord of Spirits, but like, there's a bunch of people, there's a whole meme out there that all we ever talk about is the Book of Enoch on this show.
And we have literally never done an episode on the Book of Enoch.
That's all we talk about, right? But the person in question, who's an ancient faith host, I think would say, and I think kind of has said, that, most Orthodox people don't know the actual canonical scriptures well enough to be moving on to this other stuff, right? And I think that's fair in some ways. I'm saying that kind of thing is fair, right? Because our Orthodox tradition is huge. There is no human who comprehends all of it.
Yeah.
There is no human out there who is equally an expert on Byzantine chant, extra-canonical biblical literature, Byzantine church history, right? Like, all of these things, right? Like, those of us who have gone and gotten a PhD and become an expert in something, right, have one little slice, right? And if you put all of us together in a room, right, you've got a whole bunch of slices. But I don't even think if you get all of us together in a room, right, like, seriously, like, you get a room, there may be a room like this in a few weeks, close to it, right? You put me and Father Joseph Lucas and Dr. Bo Branson and Dr. David Bradshaw, Dr. Edith, I mean, we can run down the list, right? Like, all the people you think of, it's like Orthodox scholars with PhDs in any field. If you put us all in a room, I don't think we'd cover the entirety of the Orthodox tradition in expertise.
No, and there's some parts of it that are so specialized or so localized. Like, for instance, Georgian Orthodox history is a huge subject, which almost no one in the West knows hardly anything about.
Yeah.
That's just an example.
That's what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
And so no one can master all of it. I think many thousands, if not millions, of Orthodox Christians have lived holy lives, gone on to their reward in Christ, without ever having read the entire text of the book of Ezekiel, let alone the Acts of John.
Right.
Okay, accept it, right? Accept it. This is not the most important thing for you working out your salvation, for you living the Orthodox life. It is not the most important thing, right? So I think that's fair. That's a fair point to make, right? And if I thought for a second, I think I can honestly say this. If I thought for a second that the sort of harshest knee-jerk critics of this show were right, and that we were starting some kind of weird faction within the church that was just obsessed with these obscurantist ideas and weren't really Orthodox or weren't really embracing the fullness of the Orthodox faith, I would stop doing this show. I don't think that's remotely true. I don't think you guys are doing that. I think you guys are Orthodox Christians who are just interested in this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And so from my perspective, being an Orthodox Christian who's interested in this stuff is no different than being an Orthodox Christian who's interested in Byzantine chant, or interested in Georgian church history, or interested in the historical doctrine of the Trinity, or interested in how the essence energies distinction works in St. Gregory Palamas. We're all Orthodox Christians, and we have interests that we invest relative amounts of time in different parts of the tradition that are especially interesting or resonate with us as particular people. So that's my response to what I think is the good and the fair objection. I think there's also the unfair and bad objection, which is based on just that our culture. I don't even think you could narrow it down to Protestantism. I think our culture, I think this is Plato brain. Our culture is just indoctrinating us this kind of binary thinking. Right? Of like, this is Bible. This is not Bible. Right? Bible good, not Bible bad. Right? Every moment you spend, having fun, you're not spending praying. This kind of way of thinking where, unless you are spending your time and your thought and your resource and whatever on the most important thing, it's virtually sinful. Right. And that's nonsense.
Yeah.
Right. Number one, no one actually can live like that. But Platonic metaphysics isn't real. That's not actually how God constructed the world. That's not how the world works. And so, if it's just that, hey, this isn't in the Bible, so it's bad, then, there is a third possibility, and that is that I think there are particular people who shouldn't read this stuff. Like, there are particular people who shouldn't read the book of Revelation.
Yeah, and that's Bible.
That's not to say there's something wrong with the book of Revelation. It's just where they are at a particular place in time, or the way their mind's working at the moment, or certain tendencies they have as a person. If they start focusing on the book of Revelation and spending a lot of time reading it, they're going to run off in a weird direction. Yeah. Right? And someone could do the same thing with the book of Enoch. Someone could do the same thing with the Philokalia, which is why some people get told not to read the Philokalia. Yeah. By their spiritual fathers. Right. So there's that individual level too. And if somebody's spiritual father has told them to stay away from this or that book, I'm not going to encourage them to read this or that book. Yeah. Right. Like, so there's that too. But so that's my take on that situation.
Yep. Yep. All right. Well, I hope that helps a bit, Paul. Thank you very much for calling.
Thank you, fathers.
All right. We're going to take another call. So we have, I know I always mispronounce, but you've called before. Anosh?
Yes, Father. It's Anosh. Yeah.
Anosh. Okay. Welcome, Anosh, to the Lord of Spirits podcast. Christ is risen.
Indeed, he is risen. So I tend to call. I was traveling and I'm in Chicago, so I figured I'd do my usual call on the Lord of Spirits from a different state. So
okay,
keeping up with that.
We're all over. I mean, I actually have somebody listening from Egypt tonight who commented in the YouTube chat. So it's always amazing to me where people are listening from. Chicago, that weird exotic place, almost as exotic as Egypt.
Almost as, yeah. So my question was, sorry, there's some background noise. I'm just going to try to get away from the background. My question was related to, totally off topic, but it's related to the book of Genesis. And
I think we lost Anosh. Are you still there?
Yeah, sorry, I'm still there.
Okay, related to the book of Genesis.
And I'm wondering what the connection is, or maybe there's not, is with the tree of life and Christ, because salvation comes through Christ and he gives life. And so I'm just wondering why the tree was there in the first place, or what's the connection? And what are your thoughts on that?
Okay. So, the first thing I'll say is that the cross is very often identified with the tree of life, because through the cross, incorruption, immortality, eternal life come into the world. And so it's really that the cross is the restoration of the tree of life. But of course, it's Christ's cross. And so, we don't eat fruit of the tree, we eat the flesh and blood of Christ. Right. And that is the medicine of immortality. That is the food of of eternal life right there. So, I mean, you're definitely tracking correctly. Father, I don't know. I mean, there's so many things that can be said about this. I feel like whole books have been written about this question.
Yeah, don't forget the leaves. This is a deep cut, I guess. I guess people don't know about this. But if you read the Old Testament prophets and you read the book of Revelation, the leaves of the tree of life have healing in them for the nations. Which is why you may notice that the cross as used most commonly in Orthodox crosses is the one that is blossoming.
Yeah.
Because we have as our self-identity that we are the Gentile church at this point, right? And so that blossoming is the healing of the nations, them being called back to God. So that paradise is found within the church, where the tree of life is.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if we still have you, Anosh, but I hope that helps a little bit. Are you still with us?
Yeah, that really helps. I never thought about the connection with the leaves and the cross in the churches, so that's really cool. Thank you again.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for calling. God bless you. All right. Well, so see, finally someone called. They took pity on you, Father.
Well, yeah, I mean, otherwise I'm stuck talking to you for 3 hours every 2 weeks.
Right?
So,
I mean, what do we have to talk about?
Liven it up a little bit. So yeah, speaking of livening it up, here we go. The Acts of John. So we have this text. It's middle of the 2nd century, compiled by St. John's spiritual grandchildren. At some indeterminate point after it's written, this Gnostic chunk gets shoved in there pretty awkwardly and obviously. And that version of the text comes into popular use among Gnostic groups, including the Manichaeans. Okay. So when we're talking about the original text, right? Because, I gave you a couple examples. Beyond that, I don't really care about the later insertion. That's not that interesting to me. The original text and the traditions about St. John. So this is going to escalate quickly. I'm just telling you now. Buckle up a little bit. We're going to try and be as politic and as gentle as we can about this, but wild stuff's going to ensue. So it begins with the king of, there's a king of Ephesus named Lycomedes. And Lycomedes is married to a woman named Cleopatra. Cleopatra dies. And if you remember what I was saying about the fragility of ancient people, Lycomedes sort of pines to death, and he dies too. He dies of a broken heart.
Yeah.
Due to his wife having died. They're not extremely elderly. It's not one of those things, it's just fragile constitution. I guess there were emo kids like in the mid 2nd century ruling Ephesus. But so St. John comes and he raises them both from the dead. Cleopatra first, right? So that when Lycomedes is raised from the dead, Cleopatra's alive. He is so happy that he has a portrait icon painted of St. John. You may be guessing why this comes up in the 7th Ecumenical Council. And he has it adorned with flowers, and they light candles in front of it. Right. And so St. John hears about this. Okay. And sort of comes back to see Lycomedes. And Lycomedes says, "Oh, listen, I worship only God, but I also honor the gods," lowercase g for us, who do his works and teach his word in this world, right? So he basically gives the distinction between worship and veneration, right, to St. John. So St. John responds, and this is widely open to interpretation. We'll come back to this when we get to the Second Council. But St. John responds by saying, first he says, well, you've made a dead image of a dead man. Okay. But then he goes on to say, St. John goes on to say, that excuse me, what Christ really wants is for Lycomedes to paint a portrait of St. John with his life, using his good deeds as the paints and the colors. Yeah. So St. John effectively is saying to him, the real way to honor me is not to light candles in front of my picture, but to imitate St. John's life as he imitates Christ, right? To become a saint yourself. You honor a saint by imitating them. You honor a saint by becoming a saint yourself, right? And following their example, not just by outwardly honoring their image. Okay. We'll come back to this. St. John then moves on. He goes to the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, which of course is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, is still standing at this time. Yeah. For the moment. They're having the big feast, the big annual feast of Artemis. St. John comes wandering in. He is not wearing the pagan festal garb, being not a pagan. And so this makes the priests at the Temple of Artemis very upset. They get angry. And St. John responds. He challenges them to a showdown. Prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal style showdown. But St. John says, I am going to pray to my God that you all die. And you all pray to your God that I die, and we'll see what happens.
Man. Just bringing a gun to a knife fight.
I told you this was going to escalate quickly. Yeah. Okay. So he just goes nuclear option, right? Like, bring it, right? Now, the credit of their intelligence, at least, the priests of Artemis have heard about St. John and the miracles he's been doing and raising people from the dead and stuff, and they're like, this will go badly for us. We do not accept your challenge, right? They're not stupid, right? Whatever other faults they have. And so St. John then prays anyway, and part of the temple collapses and kills their high priest. But the rest of them who are smart enough not to accept the challenge, they survive. Okay. Things have not actually begun to escalate. Now's when you really need to buckle up. Stuff's about to get weird. Okay. St. John continues his travels around. He's walking through a field. He sees a guy running through the field carrying a sickle.
It's not exactly runs with scissors, but basically.
Yes. You don't run with scissors or sickles, kids.
That's right.
No running with sharp implements, but he's running with a sickle.
I learned what a sickle is because I read Asterix and Obelix comics. And the druid Getafix was always cutting mistletoe with a sickle, a golden sickle, so he could make his magic potion. So that's how I learned when I was a kid. Yes.
But he probably would not run with it.
No, in my head, I always see Getafix's golden sickle, that he used to cut mistletoe.
And this is why, from an early age, you were indoctrinated in communism. So...
No, without the hammer, I'm safe, right?
Oh, okay. So he sees a man running with sickle. This is an unusual thing. So he stops the guy. Hey, what are you doing? Where are you going? Running with that sickle. And so the young man who was running with the sickle says to St. John, well, that he had been sleeping with another man's wife. And his father had found out that he was sleeping with another man's wife. He had pulled him aside and said, son, you can't be sleeping with other men's wives. You're bringing disgrace and dishonor upon us and upon our family. How dare you? You need to stop this. You need to get back in line. And this young man responded by getting very angry at his father and beating and kicking his father to death.
Wow.
And now having killed his father, he was now running with the sickle to go and find the woman he had been cheating with, her husband, to murder both of them, and then take his own life, presumably with the sickle. And then St. John stopped him and, he told him all this. Okay. So, let me just clue you in now. A lot of the rest of this in the Acts of John is just going to sound like St. John randomly wandering into episodes of Law and Order SVU, like halfway through. So he's on his way to kill everybody, right? So St. John says, hey, buddy, let's calm down. If I go and I raise your father from the dead, right? I'll raise your father from the dead if you agree not to go murder anyone. And the kid says, okay, I'll take that deal. And so they go back and St. John raises his father from the dead. Okay. So, okay, I no longer am guilty of the murder of my father, technically, because he's alive, even though he did murder him. Right? But still, the guilt, right? The guilt over what he'd done, the guilt over having slept with this other man's wife, and that having driven him to this horrible crime of killing his own father, he can't deal with the guilt. And he can only think of one thing that could be responsible for all this, for having driven him to do all this. And so he takes the sickle and he castrates himself.
That's why you don't run with scissors, kids, or sickles.
And then, having castrated himself, he runs again. He goes and finds the woman with whom he had been cheating and flings his severed genitals at her.
This sounds like something out of a Greek myth.
That is the first time that sentence has ever been said on the airwaves of Ancient Faith Radio.
Very likely.
Likely the last also.
Yeah.
Flings it at her and says that the thing which he has flung and she, the woman, are what got him into this whole mess. Right? Through the seduction of lust. Okay. So St. John then finds the kid again and says, son, self-mutilation is also a sin. Right? Self-mutilation is a sin, is also a sin. And not only is it also a sin, but it is just as bad of a sin as the adultery and the murder and stuff. Don't do that. Right? So we have an anti-Origenist element here to our to the Acts of John. You should not do this. And he says the real problem is your thoughts. You need to learn to control your thoughts and not act impulsively. I think St. John's kind of right on that one. The acting impulsively is clearly this kid's problem. But learning to understand your thoughts, right? To control your thoughts and not to run off after these various sins. Okay. So you might think, well, okay, text has to mellow out from here. Don't get excited yet. There's more coming. Okay. So St. John travels on. He decides he's moving on. He stops at an inn. The inn he stops at, his bed is full of bed bugs. So he sort of dispels, he sort of exorcises the bed bugs.
I mean, how many saints' lives do you get with bed bugs?
Like, yeah, to cast out the bed bugs. And then here's the next episode of Criminal Minds that he wanders into. There is this town. There is this fellow named Callimachus. Callimachus is, let's be honest, in lust more than love, with a Christian woman. Callimachus is a pagan. He's in lust after this Christian woman, Drusiana, who is married to a Christian man named Andronicus. Callimachus, the pagan man, is a horrible sex pest. And between his lewd advances, etc., he puts so much stress and anxiety on Drusiana that she dies. From all the stress and everything. How to put this delicately, this does not discourage Callimachus from wanting to sleep with her. Her being dead.
Yeah.
And so he goes with his servant Fortunatus.
Miss Fortunatus.
Yeah. If you're nasty. No. No, just Fortunatus. Goes with Fortunatus to steal her body for these purposes. As they go to do it, a snake bites Fortunatus and Callimachus and kills them both. St. John comes into the scene, raises everybody from the dead.
Hey.
Right? Callimachus and Fortunatus and Drusiana, and calls upon Callimachus and Fortunatus to repent of what they were up to and become Christians. And they, of course, see now the error of their ways due to snake bite. Oh, now I understand that was wrong.
Wow.
Yes. So we had to be a little under-detailed in that section for reasons that are probably apparent to all listeners.
It's because of the bed bugs, isn't it?
Yes, the bed bugs. We didn't want to creep people out about the bed bugs.
Right.
So then the final bit in the Acts of John is about the death of St. John. And this tradition about the death of St. John is also something that we have a lot of independent attestation of. So when St. John reaches great old age, so he's like 100 or older even, he has revealed to him that the time has come for him to die. So he goes and he digs his own grave and climbs into it and prays, sort of his final prayer, entrusting himself to God. And the dirt comes in and covers him. And that is how he dies. And he's the only one of the apostles to not be martyred. There's that version here in the Acts of John. In other versions of the story, it talks about the earth on the top of the grave still moving. Like maybe St. John is still alive in there.
Yeah, I mean, there's this tradition of, it's often called manna, but I mean, it doesn't mean manna like in the Torah, but like they call it manna anyways, coming up out of his grave like once a year. And then people, this sort of dust or whatever, people being healed because of that. Yeah.
There's also a version where his disciples come out the next day and they find his sandals laying there by themselves, like the rest of him has been assumed into heaven. But you can compare those versions.
Very left behind.
To, if you go and read the Synaxarion for September 26th in the Orthodox Church, on September 26th, we commemorate the dormition of St. John the Theologian, the falling asleep of St. John the Theologian. And you can read the Synaxarion there. There is another version of the same story. right? So this is a widely attested tradition as to how St. John's life ended.
Yeah.
So just coming back here at the end, we mentioned that the Acts of John got brought up at the Seventh Ecumenical Council. It was actually being used by the iconoclasts. So the iconoclasts, this is the end of the 8th century, right? They show up with a copy of the Acts of John and say, well, look, here, this guy made an icon and was venerating it of St. John, and in their interpretation, St. John rejected that, right? And St. John rejected that. And so, see, this is proof that the apostles rejected icon veneration.
Yeah.
The council was like, huh? And said, you know, first of all, no, that's not what's going on in the text. Second of all, you're assuming this is like authentic, right? Like that this is 100% historically accurate St. John. And then 3, hey, look at this big Gnostic section, right? In this text. Clearly, Gnostics, Manichaeans have fiddled with this text, right? So not only can you not assume it's reliable, we could kind of assume it's kind of unreliable. And so basically they threw out that argument and they ordered that the iconoclast copies of the Acts of John be burned. Right?
So why do
but
we
here's
still
the
have
thing.
them?
Yes. Here's the thing. As Father Andrew mentioned to the caller, this book is on the list of St. Nicephorus. A generation later, Patriarch of Constantinople, as him having copies in the library and saying it was beneficial to read privately. Right? So that whole burning all the copies thing never happened.
Yeah.
Now, there may have been, right, maybe there was an even more Gnostic version than the one we have now. And maybe that's the version that was burned. Maybe it was some particular version of the text or something.
Yeah.
Or maybe it was just not carried out because people pointed out there were other ways to read the text or there were other beneficial things in the text, right? And of course, the fact that it's to be read privately, right? You have to remember how low the literacy rate was, right? Anyone who could read was probably either ordained or a monastic or both.
Yeah.
Right? Meaning
So
they had
educated.
the context and everything to be able to read and interpret it properly and deal with the text properly. Right? So limiting it to those people who could read it in an appropriate way makes sense as a solution. But yes, so that's how the text ends up becoming involved in the Seventh Ecumenical Council. But any way you cut it, even if you want to say, okay, this is just a straight out Gnostic text, and you want to read it in a Gnostic way, for purposes of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, let's say this is a Gnostic text, right? Well, then this is a Gnostic text, and let's say the iconoclasts were reading it correctly. Well, then you have a Gnostic text from the middle of the 2nd century AD critiquing Christian icon veneration. And any way you read the text, you have the distinction between worship and icon veneration being made in a Christian text of the mid-2nd century.
Yeah.
Proving the antiquity of that idea, right? So you take all that into account in terms of this text and its relationship to iconoclasm. And that brings us to the end of our second half.
All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and take our second and final break. And
one more
we'll be
act.
That's right.
Of acts.
One more. The final act. It's anyway, we'll be right back.
Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung will be back in a moment to take your calls on the next part of the Lord of Spirits. Give them a call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
We live in a world that commonly sees the passion of anger as a virtue that can be used to help right wrongs. But what do Scripture and the Fathers say about anger? Is expressing outrage at societal ills a true reflection of God's attitude towards these evils? Or does it instead blind us to His presence? Father Theodore Pulcini and Oswin Creighton joined together to examine how anger affects our journey towards theosis. Find it today at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back now with the Lord of Spirits, with Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung. If you have a question, call now at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Hey, we're back. We actually had a caller waiting, and he disappeared. He disappeared. But I will, if I remember correctly, his question was, because this is a good question, like, how do you distinguish between sort of different kinds of apocrypha? You know, because obviously, you know, we're making distinctions between even portions of texts, right, that are Gnostic.
Yeah.
Just a reminder, everybody, right? There's canonical scripture, there's apocrypha, which means, you know, stuff that's okay, you know, good to be read at home privately or whatever. And then there's books that you should not read, right?
Yes.
You know, so how do you, like, you know, just kind of review that for us, Father. Like, what are these distinctions, and what's kind of a good way? I mean, I'm just going to plug your book again. It's worth it because it covers all this stuff. But just give a short outline there.
Well, I mean, historically, the church has made these distinctions for us. That's why I used St. Nicephorus's list, which one of the appendices of that book is just St. Nicephorus's list, right? So, and he's actually got 4 categories. He's got books that are read publicly, meaning canonical books. Books that some churches read publicly and others do not, which is interesting, given that it's the 9th century. For the Old Testament, he has exactly what you might expect. What are generally called the Deuterocanonicals are listed as Old Testament books that some churches read and not others. But in the New Testament, he's got both the Apocalypse of St. John, meaning the book of Revelation, as a book accepted by some and not others, even in the 9th century. And also he's got the Apocalypse of St. Peter there, and a couple of others. So I think we did an episode where we went through the Apocalypse of St. Peter way back. There's that category. Then Apocrypha, right? Meaning books to be read privately, which, as I was just saying at the end of the last half, the fact that they're to be read privately means that the people who are reading them are going to have a certain level of education and background in this kind of thing, by the fact that they're, number one, able to read, and number two, have access to the text. And then there's the category of things not to be read, which would be called another kind of a banned book list, whatever. Things that are identified as being Gnostic junk, right? Or other heretical junk. And those books would generally be excluded from libraries and that kind of thing. And when you have those listed, it's with a deliberate purpose. It's, you know, a bishop will list those because it's like, oh, I've heard there are people reading this in the churches. This is not good. Go get rid of this, right? Like, like if a bishop today found out that a bunch of parishioners at one of his churches were reading from the New World Translation, which is the Jehovah's Witness Bible translation, right? Like he might be like, yeah, get rid of those guys.
Right.
Get yourself a KJV or something.
Not just making like a list of banned books or whatever. It's about addressing actual things going on.
Yeah. Yeah. There was someone, you know, there were someone's reading this and something was happening and they say, hey, God, this isn't one we want to be. Right. we want to be reading. And so, the books that are books that are listed as apocrypha by somebody, that is somebody. So, for example, Saint Nicephorus saying, out of he has the patriarchal library at Constantinople, right? What are the sort of quasi-scriptural books, right? That are out there that I think there is some value to reading, but that I don't believe are scripture, essentially, right? And so when I go and do a book like Apocrypha, or I talk about these texts that he lists, what I'm saying is, right, well, here's a saint who suffered for the faith as a confessor, who was the Patriarch of Constantinople. He considered that this is a book that has something worth reading in it, right? So let's look at it and discuss it, see if we can figure out what the things are that are valuable here that he would point to. But this isn't an assessment that like each person is called to make for themselves.
Right.
Right. And this is important because this is, a lot of our Protestant friends talk this way. If you push them on it, they'll admit it's ridiculous and not true. Right. But they'll say things like, oh, well, when I read these books and only these books, I hear the voice of God, right? Or the Holy Spirit revealed to me that these books and only these books are scripture. And that's nonsense. Someone handed you a Bible.
Yeah.
That Bible was compiled centuries before you were born. I'm talking about everybody. Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Protestant, okay? You're handed a Bible, right? It has books in it. You're told that's the Bible, okay? At some point later in your life, you run into somebody whose Bible is missing some of those books or who has more books than you do. And you figure out what to do with that. But that's real life, okay? There is no one who was born with no concept of what a Bible even was, and you went out and read every book ever written and determined purely based on the guidance of the Holy Spirit that these 66 books and only these are the Bible, right? That's nonsense, right? No one has ever done that, okay? The question, is this book canonical, is not an open question. It's not subject to discussion. It's objective fact. A book is either read publicly in your church or it's not.
Right.
You can't really debate that. It is or it isn't.
It's the same question as, like, frankly, who is a saint of your church? It's in the list of your patriarchate or your jurisdiction.
Yes.
That's the list.
This is an objective thing.
Yeah.
Okay. You can do all kinds of special pleading, but it's an objective thing. So this is why, I mean, the show, since all we ever do on this show is talk about the Book of Enoch, right? Of course, right? I occasionally, is the Book of Enoch canonical? Should we think the Book of Enoch is canonical? I'm like, are you Ethiopian?
Yeah. If you belong to the Ethiopian or Eritrean church, then the answer for you is yes.
Yes.
But for
if
everybody
the answer to the question, are you an Ethiopian, is no, then no, it's not canonical for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And from what I am given to understand from Ethiopian people, even if you are Ethiopian, the answer is more like it's complicated. But
yeah,
right. But like the point being, this is an objective thing, right? And it's something that was decided and settled long before any of us listening or talking were born.
Yeah. Yeah. We got another question which is related to this, was actually, could Apocrypha ever be considered canonical? And I mean, obviously not. The question is, what does your church actually read as canon in church services? That's what's canonical.
Yes. So not now.
Yeah. I mean, is
if you
it
had a time machine
possible? Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it possible at some time, some place or whatever? Yeah, it's possible. And in some cases, yes, as you said, Eusebius said that, was it Eusebius that said that some churches were reading the Acts of Paul as a canonical book?
Yes.
So it was canonical for them.
So there's a Doctor Who audio drama where the Eighth Doctor has to fight Krampus. And so he jumps to the TARDIS and goes back in time and gets the actual St. Nicholas from the 4th century and brings him forward in time to Vienna to help him destroy Krampus. Okay? But if he had detoured while he was in the 4th century in Asia Minor, he could have gone into a church where they read from the Apocalypse of Peter.
Yeah.
And while standing in that church in the 4th century, the Apocalypse of St. Peter was canonical in that church in the 4th century.
Yeah.
But no such church exists today.
Yep.
Right?
Exactly.
And this challenges, the reason people have trouble with this is it challenges the view of canonicity that they have. Because the view of canonicity that they have is tied up with this whole other set of ideas of the inspiration of the Holy Spirit and this and that. And other.
It's this objectification of the text rather than how is this situated within your church.
Right. It's the text itself, right? So the authority is not in the text itself. The authority is in the church.
Yep.
It's the church's use, reading, application of the text that is authoritative.
We actually
text
have
by
gotten
itself
a couple
is a
calls.
book.
Yeah.
It is a book.
Which book?
And it is
books
not,
don't talk.
it is not ontologically different than other books. Take that, Gavin Ortland.
All right. We do actually have a couple calls that came in. They're about, I don't know. I don't want to use the word random, haphazard bits. So we actually do have someone.
I don't know that we want detailed questions about what we discussed in the last half. So
no, indeed not.
This may be safer.
Not. Indeed not. So we actually have a caller coming all the way from Australia. So Christian from Australia, welcome to the Lord of Spirits podcast.
Hello. Can you hear me well?
We hear you. Christ is risen.
You found a working phone in the atomic wasteland.
Martin Shaw would say.
So what's your question,
fathers,
Christian?
I had a question. Firstly, I wanted to tie up a loose end from the last conversation we had a few months ago on defending my use of the term platypi. you see, fathers, if you would indulge me to hear my case, the platypus is the ultimate ambiguous creature. I'm not sure if you've seen one in person before, but it's not one animal. It's a combination of many kinds of animals. It's a mammal that lays eggs. Is it a platypus? Is it a beaver? Is it a mouse? Is it some weird amphibian? We don't know. And I also, too, am an ambiguous creature, you see, because Mum's side is the Western Roman Empire and Dad's side is the Eastern. So thus, it is fitting that platypus would be a merge of both the Greek and Latin terms.
Yes, but English doesn't have to do that.
Right, I see. Well,
yeah.
Anyway, despite my schizophrenic ramblings,
it's a noble try, though. I will give you that. It's a noble thing you're trying to do.
Plus, if you say platypodus, you can put on airs.
I see. Well, it's okay. One day in my crusade for the defense of the term platypi, perhaps I may be successful. But in regards to today's question, it's not terribly related to the topic at hand. But I did want to pick Father Stephen's brain about this because I can't.
Before you do, I have one more comment. On the platypi situation.
Okay.
Is this coming out of some kind of resentment of the English as an Australian?
No, I love the English.
They are very picky about that kind of thing, and I feel like you're kind of doing the working man. They exiled you, right? And now you're going to get back at them by offending their refined grammatical senses.
My goodness, Stephen Young, I think I've just about aggravated everyone then. My goodness. The Greeks are not happy. The Romans aren't happy. The English aren't happy. My goodness.
Alas.
Anyway, regarding to today's topic, by all means, Father Stephen Damick, if you have anything to say as well, but can't find any Orthodox sources in particular talking about in the Gospels when Christ is referred to as a carpenter. I understand that there's some dispute about whether that means a literal timber worker, whether it means a builder, or perhaps even a stonemason. Would you be able to comment at all, Fathers, on if there's any scholarly Orthodox content that you may know in regards to this topic?
I'm trying to, correct me if I'm wrong, Father Stephen, but the Gospels call him, so people say he's the carpenter's son, obviously because St. Joseph is a carpenter. But does it ever describe Jesus himself as a carpenter?
Well, it doesn't describe Joseph as a carpenter either. The word in Greek is teknon.
Oh, he's a maker.
It's a craftsman, essentially. And I don't know any particularly, there's a ton of journal articles about this in biblical studies, but I don't know of any that are from an Orthodox author in particular. But so within the context of, Nazareth, we're talking about biblical Nazareth, not modern day Nazareth in Palestine. Biblical Nazareth was not in one location. Peasant villages like Nazareth in Galilee in the first century moved around because the peasants were mainly working as laborers harvesting crops for landowners. And so the village would it was more like what we would call a shanty town. It would kind of be sort of re-erected as the harvest, moved around. It would kind of move around within a specific area, but it would move around within that area. It was not fully a settlement. And so within that, St. Joseph's role within that community was that he was sort of more like a craftsman. He wouldn't have been specialized. It would have been more like we think of like a handyman. So he would have worked with wood. He would have also worked with stone. He would have worked with various things. He would have been one of the people helping erect the shelters, break down things, re-erect them, move them around, repair roofs, thatching, right? All of those kind of things for the other villagers. And that gives you an idea of the sort of poverty level we're talking about for Jesus and his family. Because, if you think, this village is primarily made up of these peasants who are getting paid basically to harvest crops. So think farm workers, okay? And Christ's father is getting paid by farm workers to work on and repair their homes. Right? He works for poor people. Right? So, and the fact that Christ also would have learned this kind of trade with and for his father, his public ministry, remember, doesn't start until he's 30.
Yeah, so, it doesn't say this, but it's probably good conjecture that he would have.
Yes, in the ancient world, that's what everyone did.
Yeah, you do what your dad does.
When you were old enough, you started assisting your father and working with him. Be that, if you had a family farm, it would have been doing that, right? Helping around the farm. But I think we've talked about this on the show before. One of the political undercurrents going on in the background of the Gospels is that by that point in the first century, 70% of the land in Judea and Galilee that wasn't owned by the Romans, right? The Romans, of course, took whatever they wanted, but the land that wasn't directly controlled by the Romans, 70% of it was owned by the high priest and his family. And they had used the temple tax to basically extort the land from the people who God had given it to in the Torah. And so those day laborers in Galilee, like in Nazareth, those were the people whose families originally owned that land and had been given that land to farm it by God. The Sadducees essentially had used the temple tax to extort it and take it from them, and now were employing them for pennies to harvest what had once been their own family's land.
And should be according to the Torah.
and should be forever according to the Torah. Yes.
Yeah.
With no Jubilee year in sight. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of what's going on with the economics of Nazareth
Interesting.
at the time of Christ's childhood.
We lost our connection to Australia there, but hopefully Christian was able to continue to listen. So anyway, all right. Well, Acts of St. Thomas. How about that? Someone actually in the chat wanted to know, is this the same thing as the Gospel of Thomas? No, it is not. It is not. Yes.
Gospel of Thomas is a whole other thing.
Yes.
And there's another potential future episode.
Mm-hmm.
Extra canonical sayings of Jesus.
Yeah, right.
Sayings of Jesus that aren't in the Gospels, but that the church fathers refer to and quote. There's more than you think.
Dun, dun, dun. Okay.
Yeah.
So what happened to Saint? I mean, the tradition, of course, is that he went to India. So is that what we're talking about here?
Yes, that's what we're talking about here.
Yes.
That's the short answer.
All of our friends in the Malacca church are like, finally.
Yes, here we go. Your moment has come. Yes. So there is, of course, just this broad tradition that St. Thomas went to India. That's attested to all over the place, right? That's not, that's not coming from the Acts of Thomas.
Yeah.
That's all over the place, right? That St. Thomas went to India. Now, if you want to hear the worst counter argument in history to that, I can give it to you.
Go for it. I'm always ready for a worst counter argument in history.
Because in my Calvinist seminary days, I brought this up. The fact that St. Thomas had gone to India. I was told by a very intelligent man, one of the professors there, who I won't name because he is very intelligent, and this answer will reflect badly on him and maybe make you question that characterization. Said to me, no, that never happened. I was like, well, how do you know that never happened? I said, I know it's not in the Bible, but I mean, there's all this attestation, right, that this happened. Why are you saying with so much certainty? He said, because the New Testament says that St. Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles.
Wow.
Therefore, if you say any other apostle converted any other Gentiles, I guess we're winking at the whole Cornelius thing. Any apostle went to any Gentiles, then you're contradicting the Bible. Was the theory there. I do not find this to be a compelling counter-argument. But besides the absence of a good counter-argument and the broad base of this tradition, there's some very specific things that we now know for certain.
Yeah.
One of the most important ones is that the Acts of Thomas, the text we're about to talk about, a lot of the action centers around a king named Gwandafer. Okay. Until very recently, like within my lifetime, everyone said, well, this is how we know that this is fake. Right? There's no such king, Gwandafer. There's no record of any king named Gwandafer in India, in any part of India, in the part of India we're talking about. It never existed. Therefore, this is bogus. And then, within our lifetimes, archaeologically, they discovered a huge cache of coins. And guess whose face and name was printed on them from the 1st century? King Gwandaforus.
How about that?
Oops. All right. And this isn't just a gotcha, like, haha, laugh at the scholars who assumed that absence of evidence meant evidence of absence. It goes beyond that, right? Because the only record we had of this king's existence until the late 20th century was in the Acts of Thomas.
Yeah.
Was in stories associated with St. Thomas going to India. Otherwise, that name was lost to history until the late 20th century. So that makes it very powerful evidence, right? Because when and how would they have made this up? How would they have known about this king in order to invent this? Right? Yeah. So in addition to King Gwandafer being confirmed, we have also now archaeologically confirmed, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that there were Christian churches, fully functioning Christian churches, with bishops who had ongoing relationships with bishops in churches in Mesopotamia by the year AD 200. Okay. You could go today. I don't recommend it. I'm not advising you to do this. I know someone who did this, though. You could go to Pakistan, and because, of course, what's now Pakistan was the western part of India before the partition by the British. You can go to Pakistan, and there are remains of churches from the late 1st and early 2nd centuries with Aramaic inscriptions, Christian churches, right? There to be seen that have been archaeologically excavated. Okay. So we know Christianity came there in the 1st century. We have details about the history of that region of India that were only preserved in these texts about St. Thomas. Right? This is a very strong, this is about as good, in terms of ancient history, this is about as good of a historical case as you get for St. Thomas having gone to India.
Yeah.
Like you do not expect more evidence than this. We believe a lot of things happened in the ancient world where we have much less evidence than this supporting it, right? But no one questions it. Okay. So then we have to ask the question once again, as apparently someone in the chat did, related to the Gospel of Thomas. Is it Gnostic? Right? And this is especially an important question because it's not just the Gospel of Thomas. There's the dialogue of Thomas the Contender. There's a whole bunch of Gnostic stuff with St. Thomas's name on it. Right? So,
yeah.
Red flags go up. There are a lot of folks, scholars out there, who just blanket assume that anything with St. Thomas's name on it is a Gnostic text. Because, you know, if the Acts of Thomas isn't, it's an exception. Right? And on one hand, it's on St. Nicephorus's list, so I want to say it's an exception, right? But it is, at best, ambiguous. And here's what I mean by ambiguous. And we're going to see specific examples of this as we go through the text. But there are significant passages and elements of it that you can read in a Gnostic way, or you can read in a not Gnostic way. Because guess what? Related to what we were saying earlier about texts not being able to exercise authority by themselves, you can read texts in different ways. Right? And so when I say that this text is ambiguous, I mean that quite literally. You can read it either way. And it's not, and neither way requires a whole ton of special pleading. Right? In the sense that, like, you know, sure, you could, like, if you find one of the kooky Jesus mythicist people on YouTube, a friend of the show, Bart Ehrman, had a debate with one at one point. It's funny to watch because there's literally a point where Bart Ehrman, he's trying to be respectful. He tries his best to be respectful. He always does in debates, but he kind of bursts out laughing at the guy because the guy says something super ridiculous. But and this guy had figured out some way to read St. Paul's epistles so that they were talking about some kind of cosmic Gnostic Jesus or something and not Jesus of Nazareth, right? It's about as kooky to imagine, right? So I'm not saying, yes, you can come up with some cockeyed way to read the Acts of Thomas to make it Orthodox or to make it Gnostic. I'm saying fairly plain common sense reading of it, you could go either way. There's stuff in it that's ambiguous enough you could go either way. So here's the first example, and we'll see some more. First example, the way you would usually make this determination, in fact, this is how scholars with St. Thomas literature in particular make this distinction. So St. Thomas is the twin, right? Didymus.
Yeah, it says it in the Gospels. Thomas called the twin.
Right. Thomas who's called Didymus. Thomas who's called the twin. Okay. So in general, your sort of bare bones, typical Orthodox historical reading of this is just, hey, St. Thomas had a twin brother. Pretty clear-cut, straightforward. When you read Gnostic texts, one of the tells when you're reading a Thomas text that's Gnostic is that it will say that St. Thomas is Jesus' twin.
Yeah. Or like his mirror or something weird like that.
Well, it gets weirder. Yeah, spiritual twin, right? And in different Gnostic texts, this goes different ways. So like in Thomas the Contender, like Thomas is a physical human and Jesus is like an ephemeral divine person, and the two of them are twins. Yeah. Like he's the material part and Jesus is the immaterial part, right? So you get weird things like that. One of the Gnostic St. Thomas gets crucified instead of Jesus because they're twins. So like they do a Patty Duke and like switch places. So there's a lot of weird twin stuff like that, right? So, okay. So Acts of Thomas, what does it say? Well, it says that St. Thomas is Jesus' twin, right? So you're like, oh, okay, wait, radar goes up. Is this Gnostic then? But then it says, well, he's his twin in that he lived a life that was just like Christ's.
Okay.
So it's like, well, okay, so is that Gnostic, or is it just saying he lived his life in imitation of Christ, right? Like he's a saint. This is what I mean by ambiguous, right? Yeah. Like, it's not totally clear. But that means that you're not going to find sort of like that piece that got added to the Acts of John, where it's just blatant in your face. Like, hey, guess what? Jesus wasn't tangible some of the time. You know, I mean, like, right. There's not stuff like that, right? That's blatantly Gnostic. But there's also not anything that's like, hey, the incarnation is real, right? Like the other way either. So the Acts of Thomas begins with Christ selling Thomas into slavery. Literally. So, okay. Yes. So,
yeah.
So, King Guanifer has sent one of his officials westward to Syria to find slaves to work on building his new palace. And so Christ appears to the servant of Guanifer and sells St. Thomas to him as a slave, as a workman to go oversee the building of King Guanifer's palace. And that's how St. Thomas gets to India. The idea here in the text seems to be trying to draw parallels to Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers and going to Egypt, right? And then, of course, once he's in Egypt, he kind of works his way into Pharaoh's court. it seems like they're trying to do a parallel there in the narrative. And that's what's going on with Thomas going there as a slave. But so as St. Thomas arrives in India, the first thing he does is disrupt the prince's wedding. King Gwandafer's son is getting married, and they're having this sort of pagan marriage procession that's going to culminate in this big feast. And St. Thomas runs in and breaks it all up. Sort of ruins the wedding and the wedding feast. Okay? So here's another thing. So the folks who are on the this is a Gnostic text side go, see, this is anti-marriage. St. Thomas hates marriages and weddings and doesn't want people to get married. Okay? On the other side, this is a pagan wedding. Pagan stuff is going on. That feast at the end is all food offered to idols, to Hindu idols in India. So is St. Thomas just breaking up the idolatry and the paganism? Right? Not entirely clear in the text, right? You could kind of go either way with it. So despite getting really mad about this, about his son's wedding being broken up, King Gwandafer has been assured that St. Thomas is this master workman. And so St. Thomas agrees to build the temple for King Gwandafer. And so he gets some money. And then he keeps coming back to King Gwandafer over and over again and being like, man, I need a little more money. I need some more money. I need some more money. Just a little more money. We're almost done. Okay, I need some more money. And finally, King Gwandafer gets suspicious and sends somebody to find out what's going on. And he finds out that St. Thomas is just taking all the money he gives him and giving it to the poor. And then preaching the gospel to them and baptizing them and stuff. Right? So he hauls St. Thomas back in front of him and says, what are you doing? You take all this money. You bamboozled me. Right? You're taking my money and giving it to the poor. You haven't built a thing. Right? You haven't put a single stone out there. And St. Thomas says, King, I have been building you a beautiful palace in heaven with the good deeds I have been doing in your name. Right? And King Gwandafer says, bull, and throws him in prison. Right?
It's like, I'm not interested in that.
Yes, he's like, I'm not falling for that. Right?
Yeah.
Throws him in jail. But then, once he has thrown St. Thomas in jail, remember where Joseph ended up, right? The king's brother dies. This is one of the themes in all of these apocryphal acts. People just dropping dead, right? So the king's brother dies, and when the king's brother dies, he goes up to heaven and he sees the palace. He sees this incredible, beautiful palace in heaven, and he asks an angel, hey, what's that palace? And he says, oh, that's your brother's palace that St. Thomas built for him, that he has waiting for him in the kingdom of heaven. Okay. And so miraculously, the king's brother comes back to life and says to the king, no, he's telling the truth, man. Really. Like, I saw the palace. It's magnificent. You should let him out. So he lets St. Thomas out of prison. He gets baptized, becomes a Christian so that he can, enjoy his palace in the life of the world to come. Okay. So having now baptized the king, St. Thomas says, well, my work here is done. And King Gwandafer's kingdom, by the way, archaeologically, is exactly where you would expect it to be. It was right on the border between India and like Parthian, like Persia, right? Like it's like right their territory, right? So the coins had Gwandafer's face and name on the front, and on the obverse side, about half of them had Zeus and about half of them had Shiva. So it was sort of a meeting point between Greek speakers, right? The Greek-speaking Roman world, the eastern part of the stretch of the Roman world, and India.
Yeah.
But his work is done in Gwandafer's kingdom, and so he decides to move on to the kingdom of Mizdeus, which is the next kingdom over. There's not a united India at this time. And so he hits the road to head there. Now, a major thing in the Acts of Thomas that you see a lot more, like in the Acts of John, there's lots of resurrections, lots of raising the dead. In the Acts of Thomas, there's tons of exorcisms, as you might expect if he's the first person bringing the gospel to pagan India, right, where they're practicing pagan Hinduism. There's going to be a lot of demonic possession that he's going to have to deal with. But kind of the most amazing episode of this happens on the road, where he runs into what in Hinduism would be called a naga, this serpent being creature, this serpent man, on the road. This serpent man identifies himself as, number one, the serpent from the Garden of Eden. Number two, the angel who led the other angels in seducing the human women to create the Nephilim. And number three, the spirit that possessed Judas when he betrayed Christ.
So basically he's saying he's the devil.
Basically, right? Yeah. But those are the three specific identifiers he gives for himself. Okay.
Yeah.
This naga. And as St. Thomas finds him, he's just bitten and poisoned and killed this dude. Okay. So St. Thomas forces this creature to bite the guy he just killed again and suck all the venom out. Suck all the venom back out. And so he does this. He sucks the venom back out. The guy he had killed comes back to life. And the naga who has sucked back up his own venom explodes.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's, I'm seeing a 1970s or 1960s Doug McClure film, Like, I feel like this is special effects of that sort. The exploding demon serpent.
I don't know. Bollywood could do a lot with this too.
Absolutely. And a big song and dance number to go with it.
Naga song and dance number. Yeah.
Yeah. Big time. Yeah.
And then it ends with him exploding. Yeah. And I don't know if they collected the pieces and made like a jacket out of it, because that would be naga hide.
Why was I not prepared for that?
But so the next thing that happens, fortunately, because he's still got a long road ahead of him to get to the kingdom of Mizdeus, is he runs into a donkey, and that the donkey agrees to carry him the rest of the way to the next kingdom. And when I say agrees to carry him, I mean that literally, because this is a talking donkey.
Yeah. I mean, in my head, talking donkeys always sound like Eddie Murphy.
Yes.
Even Balaam's ass.
Yes. Well, and that's important because why can this donkey talk? According to the Acts of Thomas, he is descended from Balaam's ass.
Hey. They've been talking all this time.
So, yes. So, technically, the book of Numbers never says that God took away the power of speech from that donkey. And apparently, according to the Acts of Thomas, he had passed the ability to speak on to his progeny. And so now, some 1,500 or so years later, there is this race of talking donkeys, one of whom is now going to carry St. Thomas to the kingdom of Mizdeus.
All right.
He does a lot more exorcisms on the way. A lot of these exorcisms involve women. There's this trope here of women becoming demon-possessed and the demons possessing them, forcing them into acts of public lewdness and sexuality. This is probably connected to certain forms of ancient Hindu pagan worship and that kind of thing in the area, which is here being characterized as demonic. Finally, he gets to the kingdom of Isdaeus, and there we get a little more information about sort of the pattern of his ministry there, which takes the form of he will go to a place, he will do miracles. Those miracles, then, once they have gotten people's attention, this pattern should be familiar from the canonical Acts of the Apostles. Once those miracles have gotten people's attention, he will use them as an opportunity to preach the gospel to those people. When those people accept the gospel, he baptizes them and then celebrates the Eucharist with them. So that is the pattern, right? One of the important things to emphasize, again, this is the earliest layer of Christian tradition. And what we see here is that what it means to be a Christian once you accept the gospel is conceived in these sacramental terms. You are baptized and then you join the sacramental life of the church. There is no sort of, oh, you're a Christian now. Here's a Bible. See you later. You guys should get together and talk about it once in a while.
Yeah.
Right? That these structures are put in place. In the Acts of Thomas, and what we would expect to see, frankly, from what we know historically about the 1st and 2nd and 3rd century church, most of his converts are actually women.
I mean, that's how it was in the early days.
Majority women, and that's the case in the Roman Empire as well. And we even get the names of a couple of the early bishops, which I'm probably mispronouncing because these are like Hellenized forms of ancient Indian names. But Sifor and Eusenes, I'm sure there is an Indian form of those names that's covering for in Greek.
Sanskrit at that point, I'm sure.
But Sifor and Eusenes are identified. The reason I say they're early bishops is they're identified as people whom St. Thomas makes his successors in particular places when he moves on to the next place.
Yeah.
Right. So there's sort of apostolic succession happening with these bishops. Once again, you see church structures here already, as part and parcel of evangelism and preaching the gospel. And so then at the end of the Acts of Thomas, we get a series of hymns. The longest and most prominent one, the one everybody talks about, is called the Hymn of the Pearl. And the Hymn of the Pearl is another one of these ambiguous texts. It's a poetic text, right? And basically, it poetically tells the story of this son who is sent by his father to Egypt to get a pearl, this very valuable and beautiful pearl. And while he's there, he's seduced by the Egyptian gods into worshiping them, and he's seduced by the women of Egypt into spending time with them, shall we say, and he sort of forgets about his mission. And then his father sends him a letter that reminds him of his mission, and he goes and gets the pearl and returns home to his father. Okay? Now you may be hearing this, and you may be thinking, wow, that sounds Gnostic. And that could be a fair reaction. There's a Gospel of the Pearl in the Nag Hammadi texts. You could read this in a Gnostic way, where this is about, sort of, you are one of the sons of God. You have fallen into the material world and become distracted by things like sex and, relations with women and the religions of this world, and forgotten your true identity and your true purpose. But now we've got, the secret gnosis, the hidden truth, the pearl. We can reveal it to you, and you can return to divinity or oneness with everything or whatever, right? You can read it in that kind of Gnostic way. You could also, however, look at it and say, this is kind of a smushing together of the parable of the pearl of great price and the parable of the prodigal son. right? Like tropes from both of them. You know, this could just be about, you know, you have a mission and a purpose in life, right? The gospel is the pearl, right? It will allow you to break away from sins like idolatry and sexual immorality, which we've seen pagan India, just like pagan Rome, was prone to, right? You can break away from these and come back to the God who created you, right? I mean, you can read this in an Orthodox way too, right? And you can throw in, why is it Egypt? Well, the whole symbolism, we were talking about Joseph before, the whole symbolism of the Exodus, right? Them wanting to go back to Egypt. We had it better, right? The whole symbolism of Egypt in the Old Testament. You could perfectly well read this in an Orthodox way also. So from beginning to end, Acts of Thomas, very interesting. Lots of good stuff. Is it Gnostic? Can be if you want it to be.
Yeah.
Can you read it in an Orthodox way? Sure. And that's a good reason for it to be on a list of books that are read privately instead of publicly. So you can make sure that people read it the right way instead of the wrong way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've been trying to think about what kind of stuff I might say in terms of my own conclusions that would sort of tie all this stuff together. I mean, there's not a single thread. I mean, there's definitely a theme of like anti-Gnosticism in some of these texts. And then, but of course, then there's some that's like, well, if you really want to read it in a Gnostic way, you could. But to me, the more important thing, because it's interesting, we got a lot of questions about like, well, how do you think about texts like this at all? You know? So I think what this does for us is it illustrates that there are a lot of different elements of Orthodox tradition that should be treated differently. You know, and for those who are influenced, well, not just influenced, I mean, grew up in, swimming in what is still, frankly, a basically Protestant culture, it can be difficult to sort this out, which is why I think we got multiple questions about this. Because, you know, most Protestants have been taught, look, the Bible is the one really reliable thing. It's true. Everything else is kind of, well, which of course we've taken that apart and shown how that doesn't really work. And so then the question is, okay, well, what am I supposed to do about texts like this? I mean, number one, there's obviously a lot that's in these that has become part of the traditional, one could also almost say in a certain sense, canonical, not like scriptural canonical, but canonical life of some of these saints. Like if you look up in the Synexadion, which historically anyways, has had an actual liturgical function, you know, parts of these being read during Orthros. If you look up in the Synexadion, the lives of some of these saints, you'll see some of the same elements are in there. Not necessarily all of them, not necessarily all the same elements, but the sum of the same elements. And so often what you'll see in the Synexadian versions of these lives is they tend to be kind of trimmer and more restrained in some ways. It's not that they're cutting out by any means like miraculous stuff, because saints' lives are full of miracles. So there's no problem like that. The question is just sort of, well, how reliable, how well, you know, based are the sources, you know, that are being used in putting together, because the lives of saints that are in the Synexadia tend to be a kind of compilation of traditions. And so the question is, you know, like, how reliable are they? So when you read stuff like this and you read, like, you know, a story about Jesus selling Thomas into slavery, how literally are we supposed to take that? Or, you know, St. Paul baptizing a lion, how literally are we supposed to take that? We're not. You don't have to take that literally. It's okay to just say, okay, this is a valuable story that teaches me certain kinds of things. That doesn't mean that we just simply say, oh, it's all allegory. You know, none of that really happened. It's all just kind of make-believe stories to teach us a lesson. No, that's not true. But the problem is that when you try to apply the question of sort of the dogmatic filter to everything, then you're going to miss the point. You're going to miss the point. This is the truth. There are saints' lives that were self-consciously fictional and even made their way into the Synexadion. You I've had a couple of conversations, and just recently heard another conversation with someone else, with Deacon Nicholas Kotar, talking especially about a saint named Averkios, who the only thing that was known about him was his name, but it was needed to read his life during Orthros. And so hagiographers created a life of Saint Averkios based on elements from other saints' lives, so that there would be something to read at the appropriate time during Orthros. So it was very self-consciously a work of what we would call fiction. But it sits there in that slot, not just because the slot needs to be filled, but because the point is to edify the listener so that he can repent, so that he can be a better Christian. And that is ultimately the point of reading any of these texts. The question, did this literally happen or not, is not the right question to ask of these texts, because that's not why they're written. I'm not saying that ancient people had no concept of fiction and nonfiction. Absolutely, they understood that some things were fiction. Absolutely. And they also had no problem sometimes mixing the two together to produce an edifying story. That's okay. It's all right. I mean, this existed in the Jewish tradition. You have Midrash, right? Sort of filling out these stories for the purposes of commentary, for the purposes of directing people to living life according to God's commandments correctly. So, it's okay that, and in these cases, like most of these are really early texts, but it's okay that even saints' lives that get transmitted over centuries and start to accumulate stuff along the way, that's okay. It's okay. Because the point of saints' lives is not to say, now this is a blow-by-blow account of what happened, and if you don't believe that, you're anathematized. No, that's not how these texts function. That's not their purpose at all, right? Another good example that's pre-Christian, like the story of Joseph and Asenath. The elements that are from Scripture in there are pretty small compared to most of the story that's there. So it's basically a kind of historical fiction. And that's okay, right? It's written to be edifying. I'm not saying it's written to be pure allegory or anything like that, but it is written to be edifying. Like, we have genres like this, okay? So these texts that we've looked at this evening are not canonical saints' lives. They're not, right? That's not what they are. There are canonical saints' lives. Canonical, again, not in the sense of being read as scripture, but being read as part of liturgical services, connected with liturgical services, put together in collections of lives of saints, this kind of thing. And they tend to be much more restrained. But even then, the question that we approach saints' lives with is not, could this satisfy, a 19th, 20th, 21st century secular historians' requirements for what they would consider true and not true? The reality is most of the time, it probably is true in that historical sense. I have little reason to doubt that, but it's still not the right question. If you're so busy asking whether this is sort of dogmatically true or not, you're missing why these stories are written. They're written so that we can be formed in the atmosphere of the church, so that we can have the mind of Christ through looking at the examples of the saints and imitate them where it's appropriate. It's not always appropriate to imitate every saint in every way. It's just not. Like, please, kids, most of you are not meant to live up on top of pillars like St. Simeon the Stylite and other Stylites did. That's just not what you're supposed to do. But nonetheless, we can see the kind of drive for holiness in the lives of even people like that. And so that's really the point of what's going on in all these things. And, there's some wild elements. And honestly, some of that's what keeps you coming back. And, you want to know more. You want to hear the rest. You want to connect. And the truth is, of course, that if you look at other kinds of texts from this period and even throughout the history of the church, there's not really much that's actually unusual there. It's weird to us as 21st century people, but it's not weird to most people throughout history, not most Christians for sure. So yeah, that's my understanding, one understanding of how to kind of understand these texts.
So at the present time, among people who identify as Christians, at least in the Americas, probably the least popular phrase is extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside of the church, there is no salvation. This causes a lot of our friends anxiety, distress. Anyone who says it is some kind of weird exclusionary bigot and bad person. But the truth that phrase is trying to express is exactly the theme where we started tonight and kind of where we ended up, which is that, as it says at the beginning of the canonical Acts of the Apostles, St. Luke's gospel described everything that Christ began to do and to teach. And the teaching of Christ and the works of Christ then continued in and through his church, his body in the world. The church is how Christ is present and working in the world today. And so all salvation comes in and through the church because all salvation comes in and through Christ. It's a logical corollary. Right? So the question is not about, is any individual person who is not a communicant member of the Orthodox Church saved? That's not the question. The question is, anyone in the world who is saved, how does their salvation come to them? It comes to them through the Orthodox Church. It's true historically, right? It's literally the Orthodox Church that copied the New Testament in Greek all through the centuries, so we have it today. It's how we got the Bible. It's how we got church structures. It's how the gospel got preached, right? Just historically, it's true. It's the source. But what the book of Acts in the New Testament and what the other extra biblical texts that we read tonight also point out is that it's true at a very existential and experiential level. How did Christ come to the city of Rome? He came to the city of Rome in the person of St. Peter, who was an apostle of the church, who came to Rome and started preaching, baptizing people, celebrating the Eucharist, established bishops as his successors. How did Christ come to India? The person of St. Thomas, one of his apostles, who came there, preached the gospel, baptized people, celebrated the Eucharist, appointed bishops as his successors, created the structures of the church. Those structures of those bishops then continued the ministry that St. Thomas had done. That was the ministry that St. Thomas received from Christ. Continued to teach Christ's teachings. Continued to do Christ's work in those places. Continued to bring Christ's gospel to the next kingdom and the next kingdom and the next kingdom and to the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. Okay. We read about some pretty extreme situations in the Acts of John. They're kind of extreme to the point of almost comedy, right? You could probably detect in the way I described them. Part of that was to diffuse just how horrific some of them were. And sexually gross some of them were, right? But I've been at this game a while in terms of being a priest, and let me tell you, there are real life situations that extreme that happen in the world. There are people who have been through, come through, been exposed to situations that extreme involving sexuality and violence and things during their life. They don't go around talking about it for obvious reasons. Okay? And what we're reading about in the Acts of John with St. John walking into those episodes is St. John bringing Christ even into those incredibly dark, incredibly sinful situations. And by bringing Christ into them, he transforms them. People who were dead are made alive. People who had gone down the most grievous, almost unimaginable road of sin turn around and repent. Okay. And so this raises the question. If Christ is going to come into your family, your workplace, your school, your circle of friends, how's he going to come there? He's going to come there through you. If you are a member of the church, then you are a member of the body of Christ. You are one of the members, one of the organs, one of the instruments through which Christ is working in the world. And the one who's designated for Christ to work through in your world. The people you know, the people you encounter, the people you work with, people you're related to by blood and by choice. Because for those people to find salvation, they're going to find it in and through the church. Whether you want to accept it or not, whether you want to think that way or not, you're the designated member of the church who's assigned to them. Right? Being a missionary isn't about, you don't have to go into the depths of pagan India and start from scratch like St. Thomas after being sold into slavery. Right? You don't have to travel very far at all for your mission field, for the place where you're called to bring Christ. And that's, I think, the thing we need to take away from these acts, even from the crazy and fabulous stories. There are places of quiet desperation, sadness, darkness, sin, distorted sexuality, all of these things, all around us, right here in the quote-unquote Western world. People who desperately need Christ. They need to hear the gospel. They need to get baptized. They need to come into the church. Lives need to be transformed. They're virtually dead. They need to come back to a new life. And each of us has the privilege, at least potentially, of being the vehicle, the instrument through which Christ does those great works. So that's what I have to say to sum all of this up.
Amen. Well, everyone, that's our show for tonight. Thank you very much for listening. If you didn't happen to get through to us live this time, we'd still like to hear from you. You can email us, lordofspirits@ancientfaith.com. You can also send a message to our Facebook page. You can leave us a voicemail at speakpipe.com/lordofspirits. And if you have basic questions about Orthodox Christianity or you need help finding a parish, go to orthodoxintro.org.
Then join us for our live broadcasts on the second and fourth Thursdays of the month at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific. Suspicions rising, answers aren't clear. I thought we made a promise. Now you've disappeared.
And if you're on Facebook, you can also follow our page. You can join our discussion group and leave ratings and reviews and share the show with a friend.
And finally, be sure to go to ancientfaith.com/support and help make sure we and lots of other AFR podcasters stay on the air. You seem to lead two lives at a time. Do I still fit in? I thought you were mine.
Thank you. Good night. Christ is risen.
You've been listening to The Lord of Spirits with Orthodox Christian priests, Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung, a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio. And I beheld, and I heard the voice of many angels round about the throne, and the beasts, and the elders, and the number of them was 10,000 times 10,000, and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power, and riches, and wisdom, and strength, and honor, and glory, and blessing. Revelation chapter 5, verses 11